Case 1. On April 17, 2023, in Bowdoin and Yarmouth, Maine, Joseph Eaton, recently released from prison, became the focus of a rapidly unfolding investigation. 4 people were found shot inside a family home, and hours later motorists were fired upon along an interstate. Investigators determined warning signs had appeared within days of Eaton's release, and attention narrowed quickly as evidence pointed toward him as the sole suspect during that violent span. Shortly after 9:00 a.m. on April 17, 2023, emergency services were dispatched to the Eaton residence in Bowdoin following a report of gunfire. Officers entered the home and located 4 adults, all deceased from gunshot wounds. The victims were identified as Eaton's parents, Cynthia and David Eaton, and 2 family friends, Robert and Patricia Eager, who had been staying there. The scene showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing suggested a burglary. While neighbors were secured and the area was sealed, investigators learned Joseph Eaton had been living at the home after his release days earlier. By early afternoon, authorities confirmed Eaton could not be located. Vehicles, personal items, and immediate contacts were checked. Despite extensive searches that day, Eaton's whereabouts remained unknown, and the case expanded from a contained homicide scene into an active manhunt across the region. Joseph Eaton grew up in Maine and had a long history of criminal convictions before his most recent incarceration. Family members had maintained contact and supported his release, allowing him to return to their Bowdoin home in mid-April 2023. His parents believed structured support could stabilize him after prison. Robert and Patricia Eager were close family friends who regularly spent time at the residence and were present that weekend. The household was familiar and informal, with no reported disputes or threats before April 17. Eaton's return was viewed as a second chance rather than a risk. That assumption shaped the days leading up to the killings, when no requests for assistance or warnings were made. It would take only days for that trust, and the sense of safety surrounding the home, to completely collapse under ordinary conditions once assumed permanent. On April 18, 2023, the investigation escalated when reports came in of gunfire along Interstate 295 near Yarmouth. Multiple motorists contacted emergency services, stating shots had been fired at moving vehicles. 3 people were struck and transported for medical treatment. Law enforcement from state police, local departments, and federal partners responded, shutting down sections of the highway. Shell casings recovered at the roadside were later compared to evidence from the Bowdoin home. Surveillance, traffic reports, and witness timelines began to align. Investigators confirmed the same firearm had been used in both locations. The timing established a continuous sequence rather than separate incidents. As agencies coordinated information, the focus tightened on Joseph Eaton. Then, ballistic confirmation connected the highway shooting directly to the earlier homicides during an intensive statewide response involving roadblocks, alerts, and rapid coordination measures throughout southern Maine corridors. Eaton was taken into custody later that day after a traffic stop connected to the interstate shooting. He was found in possession of the firearm linked to both scenes. Forensic testing matched bullets and casings recovered from the Bowdoin residence and Interstate 295. Authorities documented vehicle movement, phone activity, and witness observations to complete the timeline. Charges were filed covering 4 counts of murder and multiple counts related to the attempted killings of motorists. Investigators stated the evidence established a single offender acting over 2 days without interruption. No additional suspects were identified. When presented with the accumulated forensic results and digital records, Eaton provided a statement acknowledging responsibility. That admission removed remaining uncertainties and finalized the scope of the case for prosecutors and investigators, ending any dispute over attribution or sequence of events during the rampage period statewide documented. Eaton later entered guilty pleas to all charges, avoiding a trial. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing the number of victims and continuity of violence. Sentencing concluded the criminal proceedings, but questions persisted regarding supervision following Eaton's release. In late 2025, Eaton died while in custody. Public records provided limited detail regarding the circumstances of his death. The case prompted reviews of release protocols, risk assessment, and post-release monitoring within the state. Families of the victims and those injured on the highway pursued no further litigation. With Eaton deceased, no additional testimony or evaluation was possible. The events of April 2023 left unresolved questions about warning signs, accountability, and whether intervention could have prevented the outcome under existing systems, policies, and safeguards. Intended to protect communities after offender release decisions, statewide oversight reviews remain ongoing. Case 2. On January 27, 2020, in Colorado Springs, Colorado, 11-year-old Gannon Stauch was reported missing by his stepmother, Letitia Stauch. She stated that the boy had left the home to visit a friend and never returned. As search efforts began, investigators documented early inconsistencies in her timeline. Public appeals and media appearances contrasted with emerging evidence, and within days, attention shifted toward Letitia as her version of events failed to align with verified facts. The case began in the afternoon of January 27, when Letitia contacted authorities to report Gannon missing from their residential neighborhood. Law enforcement immediately initiated a search, canvassing nearby homes, open areas, and routes Gannon was said to have taken. Neighbors were questioned, and school contacts were checked. Search teams expanded their efforts as hours passed without results. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, discrepancies emerged. Gannon had not been seen heading toward a friend's house, and no witnesses confirmed his departure on foot. Letitia's description of the day's events changed subtly across interviews. She provided varying explanations about injuries, movements, and timing. Digital location, data, and activity logs did not support her account. While the search continued publicly, investigators began treating the case as more than a missing child report. The evidence at the scene and in records did not match the initial explanation. Gannon lived with his father, Albert Stauch, his stepmother Letitia, and his younger sister. He was described as a routine-oriented child who attended school regularly and stayed close to home. Gannon relied on Letitia for daily care, transportation, and supervision while his father was away for work. Family life appeared stable outwardly, with no documented history of runaway behavior. Gannon had medical needs that required consistent attention, making an unplanned disappearance unlikely. Investigators noted that he had not taken personal belongings or clothing suitable for travel. His relationship with Letitia was central to his daily routine, placing her in a position of constant access. As background checks and family interviews progressed, the focus narrowed. The lack of independent sightings and dependence on one caregiver increased concern, and suspicion surrounding Letitia intensified as inconsistencies continued to accumulate. Investigators obtained security footage from a neighbor's camera that recorded activity outside the home on the morning of January 27. The video showed Gannon entering a vehicle driven by Letitia. Hours later, only Letitia was seen returning. Phone data, vehicle mileage, and GPS records were reviewed and compared against her statements. Internet search histories revealed queries related to blood evidence and decomposition. Letitia provided multiple explanations, including an accidental injury and claims that Gannon had run away, each contradicting physical evidence. Forensic examination of the home identified signs inconsistent with an accident. As investigators compiled digital records and surveillance footage, the original missing person narrative unraveled. The accumulated data demonstrated a sequence of actions rather than an unforeseen disappearance, prompting a shift toward a homicide investigation supported by technical and forensic findings. In March 2020, Gannon's remains were discovered in a suitcase beneath a bridge in Florida, approximately 1,500 miles from Colorado. Forensic examination confirmed he had suffered multiple stab wounds and a gunshot injury. The location and condition of the remains indicated deliberate transport and concealment. Letitia was arrested shortly thereafter and charged with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and multiple counts related to evidence tampering. Additional charges were later added following an alleged assault on a law enforcement officer during extradition. Investigators confirmed that the travel route, timing, and forensic evidence aligned with digital data collected earlier. The discovery of the body eliminated remaining uncertainty regarding Gannon's fate and solidified the case against Letitia, establishing premeditation and extended efforts to conceal the crime across state lines. The case proceeded to trial in 2023. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, digital records, surveillance footage, and testimony establishing a clear sequence of events. The defense pursued an insanity claim, citing dissociative disorders, but court-appointed experts disputed the findings. Evidence of planning, concealment, and sustained deception was emphasized. After deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense and returned guilty verdicts on all major charges. Letitia Stauch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with additional consecutive sentences for related offenses. The ruling concluded the criminal proceedings. The case resulted in no plea agreement or sentence reduction. Gannon Stauch's death was formally classified as a homicide committed by his caregiver, closing the case while leaving enduring questions about prevention, oversight, and early detection of risk within family environments. Case 3. On April 15, 2023, in Hebron, New York, 20-year-old Kaylin Gillies was killed after a vehicle briefly entered a private driveway by mistake. The car was attempting to turn around when gunfire erupted. Investigators quickly identified the homeowner, Kevin D. Monahan, as the shooter. Within hours, authorities determined the incident did not involve a confrontation, forced entry, or threat, narrowing the focus of the investigation to Monahan's actions alone. During the evening hours, Gillies was riding in a car with friends while searching for a social gathering in a rural area where properties were spread far apart. The driver mistakenly turned into Monahan's driveway, realized the error, and began backing out. No one exited the vehicle, approached the home, or attempted contact. Almost immediately, a shotgun blast was fired from the residence toward the car. Gillies, seated in the passenger seat, was struck. The driver fled the area and called emergency services while seeking help. The vehicle stopped several miles away, where first responders met them. Despite emergency medical efforts, Gillies was pronounced dead at the scene. Law enforcement secured the area around the driveway and began an active response. Early findings indicated the vehicle was leaving when the shot was fired. The evidence at the scene contradicted any claim of an immediate threat. Kaylin Gillies was a 20-year-old woman visiting friends in upstate New York. She had no connection to the property or its owner and had not engaged in any interaction with Monahan. The group's actions were limited to an incorrect turn followed by an attempt to leave. Investigators confirmed the car did not stop near the house for any extended period. There were no weapons, threats, or aggressive behavior from the occupants. Gillies was unarmed and seated inside the vehicle at all times. Her background showed no history of violence or disputes in the area. The absence of provocation became central to the case. Authorities emphasized that Gillies posed no risk to Monahan or his property, reinforcing that the incident occurred under ordinary circumstances that escalated solely due to the homeowner's response. Witness statements from the surviving occupants of the vehicle were consistent. They described a single gunshot fired without warning as they were leaving the driveway. Physical evidence supported their accounts. Investigators recovered a shotgun from Monahan's residence and matched it to the fatal wound. Spent shell casings and trajectory analysis confirmed the shot was fired as the car was turning away. When officers arrived, Monahan refused to exit the house, leading to a prolonged standoff. Negotiators worked for several hours before he surrendered without further incident. During the investigation, Monahan claimed he believed his property was under threat. However, no evidence supported that assertion. The timeline, witness accounts, and forensic findings aligned, establishing that lethal force was used without justification. Monahan was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder and additional weapons-related offenses. Prosecutors determined that the use of deadly force did not meet legal standards for self-defense. The charging decision was based on the absence of a credible threat, the position of the vehicle, and the immediate nature of the gunfire. Surveillance data, witness testimony, and forensic analysis undermined Monahan's claim that he feared an intrusion. As the case moved forward, the defense argued that Monahan acted out of fear due to living in a remote area. Prosecutors countered with evidence showing no attempt to assess the situation or issue a warning. The self-defense argument collapsed under scrutiny, leaving the central issue focused on Monahan's decision to fire at a departing vehicle. The case went to trial in early 2024. The prosecution presented a clear timeline supported by forensic evidence and witness testimony. Gillies's family attended the proceedings as the events of that night were reconstructed. The jury found Monahan guilty of second-degree murder. In March 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the severity of the offense and the lack of mitigating circumstances. Monahan remained incarcerated following the ruling. The case became a reference point in discussions about firearm use, property rights, and self-defense. He claims it reinforced legal boundaries regarding the use of deadly force and underscored that fear alone does not justify lethal action when no immediate threat exists. Case 4. In May 2023, in Austin, Texas, Raul Meza Jr., a man with a prior murder conviction, entered a police station and confessed to killing his roommate. Investigators initially treated the statement as a single homicide admission. However, as details were reviewed, authorities discovered links between Meza and an unsolved death from years earlier. What appeared to be a lone confession quickly expanded into a case revealing a repeated pattern of lethal violence. On May 20, 2023, Raul Meza Jr. voluntarily approached law enforcement and stated that he had killed the man he was living with. Officers responded to the shared residence and found the body of 80-year-old Jesse Fraga inside the home. Fraga had suffered fatal injuries consistent with Meza's account. The scene showed no signs of forced entry, indicating the victim had known his attacker. During questioning, Meza provided additional information that drew investigators' attention to another death. He admitted involvement in the 2019 killing of Gloria Lofton, a case that had remained unresolved. This unexpected disclosure transformed the situation from a single homicide investigation into a broader inquiry. Detectives immediately began coordinating with cold case units, recognizing the potential significance of Meza's statements and the possibility that multiple cases were connected through a single offender. Raul Meza Jr. had a documented history of extreme violence. In 1982, he was convicted of killing an 8-year-old girl and sentenced to prison. After serving approximately 11 years, he was released in 1993. Following his release, Meza lived in the Austin area for decades without additional convictions. Jesse Fraga, his later roommate, was an elderly man who had allowed Meza to share his home. Gloria Lofton, the second victim, was found dead in her residence in 2019 under suspicious circumstances. At the time, investigators lacked sufficient evidence to identify a suspect. Meza's proximity to both victims, combined with his past conviction, established a clear pattern of trust-based access. His history demonstrated repeated opportunities for reintegration that ended in renewed violence, raising concerns about long-term risk assessment. After Meza's confession, investigators reopened the Gloria Lofton case. Evidence from the original scene was re-examined using updated forensic methods. Meza provided details that aligned with information not previously made public, strengthening the credibility of his admission. Forensic findings and timeline reconstruction placed Meza in contact with Lofton near the time of her death. Records and witness information were reassessed in light of his statements, allowing investigators to confirm key elements of both cases. In the Fraga homicide, physical evidence from the residence supported Meza's confession. The investigation concluded that Meza acted alone in both killings. Detectives determined the crimes were separated by years, but connected through similar circumstances involving personal access and isolation. The confirmation of these links established that Meza had committed multiple murders after his release from prison. Meza was formally charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Jesse Fraga and one for Gloria Lofton. Given the strength of the evidence and his own admissions, prosecutors prepared for trial while evaluating plea options. Meza ultimately entered guilty pleas to both charges. By doing so, he accepted responsibility for the killings without contesting the evidence. The pleas confirmed that the 2019 death of Gloria Lofton, previously unsolved, was a homicide committed by Meza. The admissions also established a documented pattern of repeated lethal behavior spanning decades. With the pleas entered, no jury trial was required. The court moved directly to sentencing, concluding the criminal proceedings while formally closing the cold case and confirming Meza's role in both deaths. The court sentenced Raul Meza Jr. to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected his prior murder conviction and the fact that he committed additional killings after being released. The ruling ensured he would never return to the community. The case prompted scrutiny of parole decisions and long-term offender monitoring. Meza remained incarcerated following sentencing. For the families of the victims, the legal outcome provided confirmation and accountability. For investigators, the case underscored the difficulty of predicting future violence and the limitations of rehabilitation assessments. The resolution closed 2 homicide cases, but left ongoing questions about whether earlier intervention or continued supervision could have prevented the later deaths after Meza's release. Case 5. On February 11, 2023, in Cheshire, England, 16-year-old Brianna Gay was found stabbed to death in a public park. The discovery followed reports that she had gone to meet friends earlier that afternoon. Investigators quickly determined the attack was not random. Within a short period, attention centered on 2 teenage acquaintances who had been with Brianna shortly before her death, raising immediate concerns about planning and intent. Brianna had been invited to meet Scarlett Jenkinson at Linear Park, a wooded area commonly used by walkers and families. Eddie Ratcliffe was also present. According to the timeline later established by investigators, the 3 arrived together and walked deeper into the park. There were no signs of a struggle near the entrance. A short time later, a member of the public discovered Brianna's body along a pathway and contacted emergency services. She had suffered multiple stab wounds and was pronounced dead at the scene. Scarlett and Eddie were not present when the body was found. Surveillance footage later confirmed that while 3 people entered the park together, only 2 were seen leaving. The circumstances indicated Brianna had been deliberately brought to the location. The evidence immediately suggested the meeting had been arranged for a specific purpose, rather than a spontaneous encounter. Brianna Gay was a 16-year-old student living in the Warrington area. She was known to friends and family as socially vulnerable and had experienced bullying. Brianna was transgender and navigating personal challenges related to identity and acceptance. She believed she was meeting trusted peers and had no known reason to fear the encounter. Scarlett Jenkinson had been part of her social circle, and Brianna considered her a friend. Eddie Ratcliffe was known through shared connections. Brianna did not carry weapons and had no history of violent behavior. Her movements that day followed her usual routine. Investigators noted that her willingness to meet reflected trust rather than risk-taking. That trust, combined with her vulnerability, became central to understanding how she was placed in a situation where she had no means of protection once isolated. Investigators examined phone data, messages, and online activity belonging to Scarlett and Eddie. Digital evidence revealed extensive conversations discussing violence and methods of killing. Notes and documents outlining potential victims were recovered. Surveillance cameras along the route to the park captured the three together, establishing a clear timeline. Location data confirmed their presence at the scene during the relevant period. The planning material showed forethought rather than impulsive behavior. Forensic examination of the scene supported the conclusion that more than one person participated in the attack. The investigation determined the killing was not the result of a sudden argument. Instead, it reflected preparation, coordination, and execution consistent with premeditation. Each piece of digital and physical evidence reinforced that conclusion. Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe were arrested and charged with murder. During questioning, both were linked to the planning materials recovered from their devices. The documents detailed methods, timing, and targets, including Brianna. The arrests confirmed that the suspects were juveniles at the time of the offense. Prosecutors presented evidence demonstrating that both had played active roles. The exposure of the written plans removed ambiguity about intent. The case proceeded under serious crime provisions due to the severity of the offense. Authorities concluded that the attack was jointly planned and carried out. No alternative suspects were identified. The arrests marked the end of the investigative phase and the beginning of formal court proceedings focused on accountability and sentencing. The trial concluded in December 2023. The court heard evidence outlining the planning, the events in the park, and the digital records. The jury returned guilty verdicts for both defendants. In February 2024, sentencing was imposed. Scarlett Jenkinson received a life sentence with a minimum term of 22 years. Eddie Ratcliffe received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. The court cited premeditation and the vulnerability of the victim as key factors. Both were ordered to be detained for life subject to parole review after their minimum terms. The case prompted national discussion regarding youth violence and online influences, while legally concluding with long-term custodial sentences for both offenders. Case 6. In 2023, in Kigali, Rwanda, a series of missing persons reports began to draw the attention of authorities. Individuals from different parts of the city had vanished after arranging meetings that never concluded. As investigators compared cases, patterns emerged pointing toward a single location. Evidence eventually led authorities to one residence and one individual. Denis Kazungu was identified as the central figure connecting the disappearances, shifting the investigation from isolated cases to a suspected serial offense. Throughout 2023, families across Kigali reported relatives who failed to return home after scheduled meetings. The missing individuals varied in age and background, but several had mentioned job offers, business discussions, or private meetings shortly before disappearing. Initially, the cases were handled separately, as disappearances in an urban setting are not uncommon. Over time, however, investigators noticed recurring similarities. Multiple victims had last been seen heading to the same general area. Statements from acquaintances suggested they had all been invited to meet someone promising financial or professional opportunities. As reports accumulated, authorities began cross-referencing timelines and locations. The repetition raised suspicions that the disappearances were connected. Investigators narrowed their focus to a small cluster of addresses, one of which repeatedly appeared in witness accounts and digital records, prompting closer scrutiny of Denis Kazungu. The victims were adults from varying backgrounds, including individuals seeking employment or financial improvement. Many were described as economically vulnerable or actively searching for opportunities. Investigators determined that Kazungu approached potential victims with offers that appeared legitimate, encouraging them to visit his residence to discuss details. Once trust was established, meetings were arranged privately. Victims often informed family members they would return shortly, indicating no expectation of danger. Kazungu's method relied on persuasion rather than force. He exploited financial need and personal trust to bring individuals into an isolated environment. There was no evidence of prior relationships between the victims and Kazungu beyond these arrangements. The consistent use of similar recruitment methods linked the cases and demonstrated a deliberate approach focused on accessibility and control. Authorities obtained a search warrant for Kazungu's residence after establishing probable cause. When investigators entered the property, they uncovered forensic evidence indicating repeated acts of violence. Human remains and personal belongings belonging to multiple missing individuals were recovered. Forensic teams documented the scene and worked to identify victims through DNA analysis and recovered items. The condition and location of the remains confirmed that the deaths had occurred at the residence over an extended period. Evidence showed attempts at concealment rather than accidental deaths. Financial records further connected Kazungu to the victims, showing transfers and possession of property belonging to the missing individuals. The findings confirmed that the disappearances were homicides and that a single location had been used repeatedly. The scope of the investigation expanded as forensic results clarified the number of victims involved. Denis Kazungu was arrested and taken into custody. During questioning, investigators confronted him with the forensic evidence and financial records. The investigation confirmed that at least 14 individuals had been killed after being lured to the residence. Each case followed a similar pattern of recruitment, isolation, and disappearance. Authorities formally charged Kazungu with multiple counts of murder and related offenses. The confirmation of 14 victims established the case as one of the most extensive serial murder investigations in Rwanda's recent history. Law enforcement publicly announced the findings, providing long-awaited answers to families who had been searching for missing relatives. No evidence suggested the involvement of accomplices. Kazungu was identified as the sole perpetrator responsible for the crimes. The case proceeded through the judicial system with extensive forensic documentation and witness testimony. Prosecutors presented evidence linking Kazungu to each victim, including DNA results, recovered belongings, and financial records. The court found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, removing any possibility of release. The conviction concluded the criminal proceedings and formally accounted for all identified victims. Kazungu remains incarcerated under a life sentence. The case prompted discussions in Rwanda regarding missing persons investigations, victim vulnerability, and early pattern detection. While the legal process reached its conclusion, the impact on the victims' families continued, with the case standing as a documented example of systematic exploitation and repeated lethal violence carried out over an extended period. Case 7. In 2023, in Pennsylvania, a series of unexplained patient deaths across multiple care facilities drew concern from medical staff and administrators. Patients who had been considered stable experienced sudden medical collapses without clear causes. Now reviews revealed a troubling pattern, and investigators soon identified licensed nurse Heather Presti as the common link between the incidents, shifting the focus from natural causes to potential criminal conduct. The initial trigger came as patients in long-term care facilities began suffering abrupt episodes of severe hypoglycemia. In several cases, individuals collapsed shortly after routine care, requiring emergency intervention. Some did not survive. Medical teams reviewed charts and found no physician orders that explained the sudden drops in blood sugar. As incidents increased, facilities initiated internal audits to determine whether medication errors were occurring. Administrators compared schedules, medication logs, and patient outcomes. These reviews revealed that the collapses frequently occurred during specific shifts. Reports were escalated to compliance officers and medical directors. While deaths in care facilities are not uncommon, the frequency and similarity of these events raised alarms. The internal findings prompted facilities to contact law enforcement, transitioning the matter from a medical inquiry to a criminal investigation. The affected patients were primarily elderly and medically fragile individuals receiving long-term or assisted care. Many were unable to advocate for themselves or recognize medication irregularities. Families trusted that licensed professionals were providing appropriate treatment under physician supervision. The patients had varying health conditions, but shared no diagnosis requiring insulin administration. Their dependence on caregivers made them particularly vulnerable to misuse of medication. Investigators noted that the trust placed in nursing staff allowed unrestricted access to patients and medical supplies. Heather Presti worked directly with these individuals, administering care during routine shifts. There was no prior indication to families that their loved ones were at risk. The absence of external warning signs underscored how easily a caregiver could exploit access within institutional settings designed to provide protection. Investigators reviewed medication logs, electronic health records, and pharmacy inventories. They discovered insulin had been administered to patients without medical justification. Toxicology reports confirmed insulin presence in patients who were not diabetic. Staffing records showed that Presti was on duty during multiple incidents across different facilities. Investigators identified a consistent correlation between her shifts and the medical emergencies. Witness statements placed her in patient rooms shortly before collapses occurred. Surveillance and access records confirmed her ability to obtain insulin without detection. The pattern established that the incidents were not accidental or isolated errors. Instead, the evidence demonstrated deliberate misuse of medication over time. The findings linked Presti directly to each event under investigation, forming the basis for criminal charges. Heather Presti was arrested after investigators compiled sufficient evidence. She was charged with multiple counts of homicide and attempted homicide related to insulin poisonings. Authorities alleged that she intentionally administered insulin to patients who did not require it, causing fatal and near-fatal outcomes. Additional charges reflected the number of victims and the repeated nature of the conduct. Law enforcement continued reviewing cases from facilities where Presti had worked, expanding the scope of the investigation. The arrest marked the confirmation that the patient deaths were not natural occurrences. Prosecutors announced that the evidence showed a sustained pattern of intentional harm carried out under the guise of medical care. Presti was held in custody pending court proceedings. Presti later entered guilty pleas to multiple charges, including homicide and attempted homicide. The court accepted the pleas, eliminating the need for a trial. She was sentenced to consecutive life terms in prison, ensuring she would never be released. Her nursing license was permanently revoked. The sentencing concluded the criminal case, formally acknowledging the deaths as intentional acts. The case prompted reviews of medication security protocols and oversight practices in care facilities across the state. Presti remains incarcerated under multiple life sentences. The legal outcome closed the proceedings while leaving ongoing questions about detection, supervision, and safeguards for protecting vulnerable patients within institutional care environments. Case 8. In January 2026, in Indiana, human remains were recovered during a renewed search connected to a long-term missing person investigation. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains belonged to an individual who had disappeared in January 2023. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, evidence linked the killing to Richard Fox, an inmate already serving a lengthy prison sentence for earlier violent crimes, expanding the scope of his known offenses. The trigger for the case came when investigators returned to a previously searched area using updated forensic methods and new intelligence. During the search, human remains were located and secured for examination. Forensic specialists conducted DNA testing and anthropological analysis, ultimately identifying the victim as a person reported missing nearly 3 years earlier. The condition of the remains indicated death had occurred shortly after the 2023 disappearance. Investigators confirmed the location was consistent with areas Fox had access to before his incarceration. The recovery ended years of uncertainty for the victim's family but immediately raised further questions. The circumstances suggested the death was not accidental and had been intentionally concealed. Once identification was confirmed, the case was reclassified from missing person to homicide, triggering a full criminal investigation focused on linking the crime to a known offender. The victim had been reported missing in January 2023 after failing to return from routine activities. Family members stated the disappearance was out of character and immediately reported concerns to authorities. Initial searches produced no results, and the case gradually went cold as leads diminished. There was no evidence of voluntary disappearance, financial activity, or contact after the reported date. The victim's daily routine and social connections were documented, revealing contact with individuals within Fox's broader network during the relevant period. The absence of witnesses and physical evidence initially prevented identification of a suspect. Over time, the case remained open but inactive, pending new information. The discovery of the remains provided the first definitive confirmation of death and allowed investigators to establish a concrete timeline connected to Fox's period of freedom prior to his arrest on unrelated charges. Investigators reviewed phone records, location data, and financial activity connected to both the victim and Richard Fox. Digital evidence showed communication between the two shortly before the disappearance. Witness statements that had previously seemed insignificant were reevaluated and placed Fox in proximity to the victim during the relevant time frame. Forensic analysis from the recovery site was compared with known evidence from Fox's earlier cases, revealing similarities in disposal methods. Investigators also examined Fox's movements prior to his incarceration, confirming access to the area where the remains were found. The convergence of digital data, witness recollections, and forensic findings established probable cause. The evidence demonstrated that the victim's disappearance and death aligned with Fox's known pattern of behavior. Although Richard Fox was already incarcerated, prosecutors sought a formal indictment to ensure accountability for the 2023 homicide. In January 2026, a grand jury returned charges against Fox related to the newly identified victim. The indictment formally connected him to the killing and expanded his criminal record. Authorities emphasized that the charges were necessary despite his existing sentence, as they provided official recognition for the victim and their family. Fox was notified of the charges while in custody, and legal proceedings were initiated. The indictment confirmed that Fox's history of violence extended beyond the crimes for which he had already been convicted. No plea agreement had been reached at the time of charging. As of early 2026, the case remained active within the court system. Prosecutors prepared to present evidence linking Fox to the 2023 homicide while continuing to review other unsolved cases for potential connections. Investigators acknowledged the possibility of additional victims based on Fox's timeline and behavior patterns. The proceedings aimed to formally document the full scope of his actions rather than alter his incarceration status. For the victim's family, the indictment provided official acknowledgement and a measure of closure. The case underscored the importance of continued cold case review and raised broader implications about unidentified victims and unresolved disappearances potentially connected to already incarcerated offenders. Case 9. In late 2023, in Los Angeles, a series of killings targeting unhoused individuals began to draw attention from investigators. What initially appeared to be isolated acts of violence gradually revealed a pattern. Victims were found in separate locations but under similar circumstances. As connections emerged, authorities determined the crimes were linked. The investigation shifted toward identifying a single offender responsible for repeatedly targeting some of the city's most vulnerable residents. The first incidents were reported weeks apart and occurred in different neighborhoods. Each victim was found alone in areas commonly used by unhoused individuals to sleep or shelter. Early cases were treated independently, as violence against unhoused populations was not uncommon and often lacked witnesses. Over time, similarities became difficult to ignore. The timing of the attacks, the locations, and the manner of injury aligned. Investigators began sharing information across precincts, comparing reports and forensic details. Analysts recognized that the victims had been attacked during late-night or early morning hours when foot traffic was minimal. As additional cases surfaced, the probability of coincidence diminished. Task forces were formed to reassess earlier incidents collectively. This shift in perspective transformed the investigation from reactive responses to a coordinated search for a serial offender. The victims were individuals experiencing homelessness, many living in encampments or isolated urban spaces. They had limited access to protection, medical care, or consistent communication with family. Environmental factors such as poorly lit areas, lack of surveillance, and minimal foot traffic increased their vulnerability. Investigators noted that the victims were attacked while resting or alone, reducing their ability to defend themselves or seek help. Their living conditions made immediate identification and reporting more difficult, delaying discovery in some cases. Despite differing personal histories, the victims shared exposure to the same risks associated with street living. Authorities emphasized that the lack of social visibility contributed to delayed pattern recognition. The circumstances highlighted how environmental neglect and social isolation created conditions that allowed repeated violence to occur without immediate detection. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses, traffic cameras, and public transportation systems. Analysts identified a vehicle appearing near multiple crime scenes within relevant timeframes. Tips from the public further narrowed the focus. Investigators cross-referenced license plate data and movement patterns, eventually identifying Jard Powell as a person of interest. Digital evidence, including phone location data, placed Powell in proximity to several attack sites. Witness statements from surviving victims provided consistent descriptions of the attacker's approach. Forensic comparisons supported the link between cases. As evidence accumulated, investigators concluded the attacks were intentional and targeted rather than random. The convergence of surveillance, digital records, and testimony established a clear investigative path toward Powell. Jard Powell was arrested following a coordinated operation. A search of his vehicle and residence yielded items linking him to the attacks, including weapons consistent with those used and personal property belonging to victims. Forensic testing connected the recovered evidence to multiple crime scenes. Powell was charged with several counts of murder and attempted murder. Authorities stated that the evidence demonstrated a sustained pattern of targeting unhoused individuals. The arrest brought an end to the series of attacks and confirmed that the cases were connected through a single offender. Investigators continued reviewing additional incidents to determine whether further charges were warranted. Powell remained in custody as prosecutors prepared the case for trial. Powell was later convicted on multiple counts of murder and related offenses. The court imposed multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never be released. The sentencing reflected the number of victims and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals. The case concluded the criminal proceedings, but prompted broader discussions regarding the safety of unhoused populations and law enforcement response. Investigators emphasized the importance of recognizing patterns in crimes involving marginalized communities. Powell remains incarcerated under life sentences. The case formally documented the series of killings and established accountability, while leaving ongoing questions about prevention, visibility, and protection for those living without stable housing. Case 10. In the early 2020s in Thailand, a series of sudden deaths among women with social and financial ties to the same individual raised growing concern. Several victims collapsed shortly after meeting a woman they considered a friend. Medical explanations initially varied, but similarities in timing and circumstance drew scrutiny. Investigators later identified Sararat Rangsiwathaporn as the common link, exposing a calculated poisoning scheme operating under the appearance of ordinary social relationships. The case first drew attention after a woman died unexpectedly following a meal shared with Sararat. The death was initially attributed to a medical emergency. However, toxicology testing revealed the presence of cyanide, a fast-acting poison not associated with accidental exposure in routine settings. Authorities reviewed recent contacts and discovered the victim had spent time with Sararat shortly before becoming ill. The finding prompted investigators to re-examine other recent deaths reported as sudden or unexplained. In several instances, similar symptoms had preceded death. Toxicology reports from earlier cases were revisited, and cyanide was identified again. The repeated presence of the same poison shifted the investigation from isolated incidents to suspected homicide. This marked the beginning of a wider inquiry into Sararat's social circle and recent interactions. Investigators determined that Sararat had formed friendships with multiple women over time. Many of these relationships involved financial interactions, including loans or shared expenses. Victims trusted Sararat and met her willingly in public or private settings. Authorities identified a pattern in which victims became ill after consuming food or drinks provided during these meetings. Financial records showed that Sararat often owed money to the victims or benefited from their deaths through debt relief or access to personal property. The victims varied in age and background, but shared a connection to Sararat through personal trust. There was no evidence of forced contact. The targeting relied on familiarity and access rather than coercion, allowing the crimes to go undetected initially. As the investigation expanded, authorities linked multiple deaths through toxicology findings and shared contact histories. Cyanide was identified in several victim systems, and timelines showed each had recently met Sararat. Investigators reconstructed meetings using phone data, witness statements, and financial transactions. Patterns emerged in locations, methods of administration, and post-incident behavior. Items belonging to victims were traced to Sararat. Additional cases of severe illness were also linked to her, suggesting attempted poisonings. The cumulative evidence demonstrated a consistent method and repeated execution. Each confirmed link strengthened the conclusion that the deaths were intentional and connected. The scope of the case grew as more victims were identified through systematic review. Sararat Rangsiwathaporn was arrested after investigators established probable cause linking her to multiple poisonings. During searches, authorities recovered evidence connecting her to several victims. As the inquiry continued, the number of confirmed victims rose to at least 14. Prosecutors filed multiple charges related to premeditated poisoning. The scale of the case made it one of the most significant serial homicide investigations in Thailand's recent history. Officials stated that Sararat had acted alone. The arrests and public disclosures provided answers to families who had previously been told their relatives died of natural causes. The case transitioned fully into the judicial phase with extensive documentation of each incident. Sararat was later convicted on multiple counts of murder. The court cited premeditation, repetition, and financial motive in its ruling. Given the number of victims and the method used, the court imposed a death sentence. Under Thai law, the sentence remains subject to mandatory appeals and review, which can extend the timeline before enforcement. Sararat remains incarcerated while the appeals process continues. The case concluded the criminal investigation, but raised ongoing questions about detection of poisoning crimes and the use of trust as a method of access. The legal outcome formally acknowledged each victim and established responsibility, while leaving broader discussions about prevention and oversight unresolved. Case 1. On December 23, 2023, in Friendswood, Texas, 17-year-old Connor Hilton invited two close friends to his home. What was expected to be a typical hangout ended in violence. Hilton opened fire with an AR-15 rifle, killing Ethan Riley and seriously injuring Benjamin Bleak. Investigators stated Hilton showed no signs of panic or confusion after the act. In his confession, Hilton admitted he had wanted to kill someone for a long time, revealing this wasn't spontaneous. It had been considered. The crime stunned the community, especially given the calculated nature of the attack. At the scene, Hilton shot Riley and Bleak without warning. The shooting occurred in his own home, during a gathering framed as casual. Ethan Riley died from multiple gunshot wounds, while Bleak was left with severe injuries. Neighbors reported no indication of struggle beforehand. Hilton remained on the property and did not attempt to hide evidence or flee. The weapon was located nearby. Surveillance footage from neighboring homes confirmed the boys had arrived willingly, with no signs of forced entry or danger. The planned betrayal of trust made the crime more chilling. From the beginning, authorities suspected premeditation. Ethan Riley and Benjamin Bleak had known Hilton since early high school. Friends described them as a tight-knit group. Riley was involved in extracurriculars and known for his positive energy. Bleak survived but required multiple surgeries. None of Hilton's teachers or peers reported warning signs. He was seen as quiet but polite. His online presence showed no overt signs of violence or instability. The shooting came as a complete surprise to classmates and faculty. Hilton's betrayal was particularly hard to grasp, given the years-long friendship between the boys. The idea that Hilton could conceal such intent over time disturbed the entire community. The investigation revealed Hilton had retrieved the AR-15 from inside his home and waited until both victims were in close range. He fired with precision. The rifle was legally owned by a family member. Forensics found no signs of struggle from Riley, suggesting the attack was swift. Bleak's wounds indicated he attempted to flee or resist after the first shots were fired. Hilton confessed on the scene and later gave detectives a detailed account of his motivations. He claimed he wanted to know what it felt like to kill and chose people he knew because it would be easier. These statements eliminated doubt about motive. Hilton was arrested at the scene without resistance. He was taken into custody and charged with murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. In interviews, he did not display remorse. When asked why he chose to kill that day, Hilton responded that he had felt ready. His statements showed he had been thinking about committing a murder for some time. The defense team initially explored whether medication for acne, Accutane, might have contributed to his behavior. But prosecutors pointed to his detailed confessions and planning as clear signs of intent. The court ruled out diminished capacity based on medical testimony. In September 2025, Hilton pleaded guilty, avoiding a public trial. He received a 50-year sentence for murder and 20 years for assault, to be served concurrently. Under Texas law, he will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years. The courtroom remained silent as families listened to the sentence. Bleak, the surviving victim, addressed Hilton directly, questioning his tears in court as performative. Riley's parents described the enduring pain of losing their son and the betrayal by someone they welcomed into their home. The case was covered widely in state media, cited as an example of hidden violence and the unpredictability of adolescent offenders. Case 2. In 2017, London police uncovered one of the most disturbing terror plots ever involving a minor. Safa Buller, a teenager influenced by ISIS ideology, planned to detonate grenades and carry out knife attacks at the British Museum. She was only 17 years old when she became the center of the UK's youngest all-female terror cell. Investigators later confirmed that her motivation stemmed from online radicalization. The plot, though stopped in time, revealed how digital extremism could turn a quiet teenager into a willing instrument of mass violence. The case began when MI5 analysts intercepted coded online messages referring to an event described as a tea party. The phrasing seemed harmless but triggered suspicion after it appeared repeatedly in encrypted chat rooms known for extremist activity. Counterterrorism units began monitoring the sender, who was traced to Buller's London address. Within days, agents identified communications detailing weapon acquisition and public targets. The decision to strike was made after she received instructions for assembling homemade explosives. When officers raided her home, they discovered handwritten plans outlining a public attack in Sen. Trau, London. The early interception prevented what authorities called a mass casualty event. Buller's path to radicalization began online at age 16. She spent hours watching extremist propaganda and communicating with individuals posing as mentors. Her social media history revealed a gradual transformation from curiosity to ideology. At home, she lived with her mother and sister, both later implicated for their involvement. The sisters maintained regular contact with overseas recruiters who promised them purpose and sacrifice. Friends described Buller as quiet and withdrawn before the arrest, with no overt signs of extremism. Yet investigators found digital evidence showing she had already pledged allegiance to ISIS, viewing herself as part of a broader cause. Her radicalization reflected how easily ideology could infiltrate ordinary homes through digital networks. Surveillance footage and phone records confirmed consistent communication between Buller and a known ISIS operative based abroad. The encrypted chats detailed her intent to target large crowds at the British Museum during peak visiting hours. Investigators decrypted several messages that outlined attack methods, including the use of pressure cooker explosives and close-range knife assaults. The coordination between her sister, and another woman demonstrated a structured attempt to carry out simultaneous acts of terror. MI5 officials described the level of organization as unprecedented for an individual of her age. Every recovered message reinforced the seriousness of the plot and the precision of its planning. Police arrested Safa Buller before the attack could occur. During the raid, counterterrorism officers found her devices still active in encrypted chat applications. The recovered messages contained final instructions from an overseas contact urging her to act immediately. Buller and her family were taken into custody under the UK's Terrorism Act. During court proceedings, prosecutors presented surveillance footage, recovered documents, and online correspondence linking her directly to recruitment networks. The defense acknowledged her involvement but emphasized her youth and influence by manipulative figures online. Despite this, the court determined her actions demonstrated full awareness of the consequences. In 2018, Buller was convicted of preparing acts of terrorism. The judge called the case a warning of how digital platforms could be weaponized for ideological recruitment. She received a life sentence with a minimum term of 13 years before eligibility for parole. At sentencing, the court highlighted her age but also the gravity of her intentions. Buller remains the youngest woman in the UK ever convicted for plotting a terror attack. Her case reshaped how British counterterrorism agencies approach youth radicalization and online extremism, marking a pivotal moment in national security policy. The planned attack never took place, but its exposure left a lasting imprint on how early digital signals of extremism are now treated as potential threats. Case 3. In May 2024, the quiet city of Casper, Wyoming, became the scene of a calculated killing that stunned the community. 17-year-old Evan Castiner had been stalking his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Lana Brown, for weeks after she ended their relationship. On a calm spring afternoon, he confronted her near a neighborhood park and shot her execution style at close range. Witnesses reported hearing a single gunshot followed by silence. When officers arrived, Brown was found lying on the walking path with fatal injuries. The investigation quickly revealed that the act had been planned, not impulsive. The events leading to the murder began days earlier when Castiner sent Brown a series of threatening messages. In them, he accused her of humiliating him and warned that she would regret ending the relationship. Friends of Brown urged her to report the messages, but she hesitated, believing he was venting frustration rather than making a credible threat. On the evening of May 14, Brown went for a walk near a public park as part of her usual routine. Surveillance footage later showed Castiner's car circling the area multiple times before stopping along her route. Moments later, Brown was shot once in the head. The precision and lack of hesitation pointed to deliberate intent. Lana Brown was a recent high school graduate with plans to attend community college in the fall. She was known for her easygoing nature and close friendships. Those who knew her described her as kind and trusting, someone who avoided confrontation. Her relationship with Castiner had lasted nearly a year before ending quietly in early April. Friends later told investigators that she had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his controlling behavior. Despite clear signs of obsession, there was no history of police reports or restraining orders. Brown's family later said she underestimated his unstable ID, unaware of the depth of his anger. Detectives obtained search warrants for Castiner's phone and vehicle within hours of the shooting. Digital forensic analysis revealed that he had tracked Brown's movements using a location-sharing app she had forgotten to disable. GPS data placed him at the crime scene minutes before the shooting. Text messages, internet searches about clean gunshot execution, and how to erase GPS history, and deleted photos of Brown were all recovered. A spent cartridge found near the body matched the handgun seized from his home. Police concluded that Castiner had followed Brown for several days, waiting for an opportunity when she was alone. The timeline eliminated any notion of spontaneity. Castiner was arrested at his residence without incident less than 12 hours after the shooting. During questioning, he showed no visible emotion and admitted to the crime in a detached tone. When detectives asked why he had done it, he replied that he wanted her to feel what he felt. There were no signs of remorse throughout the interviews. Psychologists who evaluated him later described his demeanor as cold and analytical, displaying traits consistent with antisocial behavior. Prosecutors argued that his confession demonstrated premeditation rather than emotional breakdown. The case was built almost entirely on his own words, combined with overwhelming digital evidence. In February 2025, Castiner was sentenced to serve 42 to 75 years in state prison for first-degree murder and weapons charges. The court rejected any plea for leniency based on his age, citing the deliberate nature of his actions. During sentencing, Brown's family urged the public to take online threats seriously, emphasizing how easily warnings can be dismissed until it is too late. The case became a reference point in Wyoming for discussions around digital stalking and teenage relationship violence. For the community, the murder of Lana Brown was a reminder that danger can emerge quietly from someone once considered safe. Case 4. In March 2019, the small town of Ross-on-Wye in Herefordshire was shaken by the discovery of a newborn's body inside a household bin bag. 19-year-old Paris Mayo had secretly given birth at home and suffocated the infant shortly after delivery. She hid the body in a plastic bag and left it for her family to find. The event revealed a tragedy concealed behind closed doors, one that combined secrecy, fear, and deliberate intent. When questioned, Mayo claimed she hadn't realized she was pregnant, a statement soon challenged by investigators. The case began when Mayo's family discovered the infant's remains the morning after the birth. Her mother found the bag while cleaning and called authorities immediately. Paramedics and police arrived at the scene, confirming that the baby had been deceased for several hours. Mayo appeared pale and disoriented, insisting she had been unaware of the pregnancy and believed the baby was stillborn. Detectives noted inconsistencies in her account, especially the state of concealment and the absence of panic that would typically accompany a medical emergency. The discovery initiated a detailed forensic investigation, revealing evidence that contradicted her initial explanation. Paris Mayo lived at home with her parents and younger brother. Friends described her as reserved, with few close social contacts. Throughout the pregnancy, she continued her daily routine and concealed physical changes by wearing loose clothing. No one in her family suspected she was expecting a child. Medical records showed she had not attended any prenatal appointments or sought healthcare advice. Investigators later determined that the father of the child was an older man, though he was not implicated in the crime. The hidden pregnancy, coupled with her calm demeanor after birth, led police to suspect an intentional act rather than a panic-driven reaction. The post-mortem examination provided critical findings. The infant had suffered severe head trauma, including multiple skull fractures, consistent with blunt force impact shortly after birth. There were also clear signs of suffocation. DNA tests confirmed Mayo as the biological mother, eliminating any doubt. Digital forensics recovered online searches from her phone related to late-term pregnancy symptoms and concealment. The data showed she had knowledge of her condition well before the birth, contradicting her claims of ignorance. Detectives also found deleted text messages indicating fear of family reaction if the pregnancy were revealed. Each new detail pointed toward a deliberate attempt to hide both the pregnancy and its fatal outcome. Mayo was arrested on suspicion of murder and later charged with infanticide. During questioning, she maintained that she believed the baby was stillborn and acted in panic. However, the prosecution argued that her actions, the suffocation, concealment, and failure to seek medical assistance, demonstrated premeditation. Expert testimony from medical professionals confirmed the baby had been born alive and healthy. The court concluded that Mayo's behavior after the birth, including her methodical concealment, ruled out temporary insanity or loss of control. Her statements to police were found to be inconsistent, and the physical evidence directly contradicted her narrative. In June 2023, Paris Mayo was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 12 years before eligibility for parole. The judge described the case as a devastating combination of secrecy and cruelty. The ruling highlighted the legal distinction between infanticide and intentional homicide, emphasizing that evidence supported the latter. In 2025, her defense team filed an appeal, arguing that her mental state and age at the time warranted reconsideration of the sentence. The case continues to draw public attention, raising complex questions about denial of pregnancy, adolescent psychology, and accountability in crimes involving newborns. Case 5. May 2019, Wiltshire. 17-year-old Thomas Griffiths traveled to the home of his former girlfriend, Ellie Good, and stabbed her 13 times. The attack occurred after a recent breakup. When officers arrived, the scene suggested extreme violence and a single assailant. Initial observations included multiple puncture wounds and blood spatter patterns inconsistent with an accidental injury. Investigators noted that the severity and number of wounds pointed to an intent to kill rather than an isolated outburst. The presence of staging elements at the scene immediately raised questions about the account later offered by the defendant. Good's body was discovered with a knife positioned as if self-inflicted, and Griffiths initially claimed he had come upon a scene of self-harm. Emergency responders described the placement of the weapon and the victim's posture as atypical for a self-inflicted wound. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices earlier in the evening, but did not report seeing a forced entry. Forensic teams documented the scene extensively, recording blood spatter, wound trajectories, and the location of a discarded phone. The purported self-harm explanation prompted investigators to scrutinize both physical evidence and the defendant's narrative for inconsistencies that might indicate staging. Ellie Good had recently ended a relationship with Griffiths after a period of escalating conflict. Witness statements described a volatile dynamic in the final weeks before the attack, with arguments and warnings from peers about his instability. Good was remembered by friends and family as cautious following the breakup, taking steps to limit contact. Griffiths had a documented history of substance use and previous incidents that suggested difficulty managing anger. Those who knew him described him as capable of intense emotional responses. The relationship context, combined with prior behavioral indicators, framed the attack as the culmination of escalating tension rather than an isolated incident. Forensic analysis produced key contradictions to Griffiths' initial claim. Medical examiners detailed defensive wounds on the victim that indicated a struggle, and analysts determined that several of Griffiths' injuries were self-inflicted in a manner inconsistent with immediate intervention. Blood spatter analysis placed the primary assault at a location within the home where Griffiths admitted he had been present. Trace evidence connected Griffiths to the weapon and the scene in ways that undermined the self-harm narrative. Investigators also recovered phone records showing deleted messages and searches consistent with planning or cover-up. The totality of physical and digital evidence suggested the scene had been intentionally altered to mislead authorities. Confronted with forensic inconsistencies, Griffiths provided a subsequent statement admitting his involvement in the attack. He described a confrontation that escalated into violence, then acknowledged efforts to stage the scene to support an alternate explanation. The confession followed detailed questioning about wound patterns and the physical impossibility of his initial account. Arrest procedures were carried out promptly after the statement, and Griffiths was taken into custody without resistance. Prosecutors emphasized the confession and the forensic linkage when filing charges, framing the case as premeditated assault culminating in homicide. At trial, the court weighed the forensic record, witness testimony, and Griffiths' admissions. The jury found him guilty of murder. Sentencing reflected both the brutality of the attack and his age at the time, resulting in a life sentence with a minimum term of 12.5 years before eligibility for parole. In the wake of the verdict, Good's family and local advocates called for strengthened protections and education regarding domestic violence among young people. Campaigns citing the case argued for clearer reporting mechanisms and better support for those exiting volatile relationships. The conviction and its aftermath sustained public attention on the risks posed by intimate partner violence in adolescent populations. Case 6. November 2009, South Dakota. Maricela Nicolasa Diaz, a teenage girl and her boyfriend carried out a brutal murder that would leave an entire community shaken. Their victim was 16-year-old Jasmine Guevara, who was found stabbed multiple times and burned in a remote area. The level of violence and deliberate concealment led investigators to believe this was a crime driven by emotion and planned aggression. What appeared at first to be a senseless attack soon revealed the dangerous undercurrents of jealousy and manipulation that had brewed beneath the surface of a teenage social circle. Jasmine's body was discovered in a secluded area, partially burned and bearing numerous stab wounds. The brutality shocked even seasoned investigators. Initial confusion surrounded the cause and context of her death, but forensic examination revealed that the injuries had been inflicted before the fire was set, ruling out any accidental involvement. Evidence at the scene, along with witness statements, quickly pointed to Maricela and her boyfriend as persons of interest. Their behavior in the days following the murder raised red flags, particularly their inconsistent accounts and apparent lack of remorse. Jasmine had known Diaz socially through mutual connections at school. There had been previous signs of tension and jealousy, particularly surrounding Diaz's relationship. Witnesses recalled hostile remarks and minor conflicts that escalated over time. Investigators later concluded that Diaz viewed Jasmine as a threat to her relationship, and that the murder had been a calculated act of control and elimination. The motive was not one of random violence, but of deep-seated envy and emotional obsession. The social environment around the teens, marked by rivalry and secrecy, served as a toxic backdrop for the crime. Authorities obtained a confession early in the investigation, with Diaz detailing her role in the killing and implicating her boyfriend. However, as the case progressed, Diaz attempted to recant portions of her confession, claiming coercion and misunderstanding. The defense argued that she was under emotional duress and possibly manipulated by her partner. Despite these claims, the forensic evidence, including matching DNA and eyewitness testimony, corroborated her original statements. Appeals citing interrogation issues were filed, but ultimately rejected by the courts, affirming the strength of the initial confession and the surrounding case facts. Diaz was charged and tried as an adult due to the severity of the crime. Despite her age at the time of the murder, the prosecution successfully argued that the brutality and premeditation warranted adult sentencing. In 2015, she was sentenced to 80 years in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years. The boyfriend received a similar sentence. The case was widely publicized in South Dakota and sparked discussions about teenage violence, peer influence, and the psychological vulnerability of adolescents under toxic emotional pressure. It remains one of the most disturbing juvenile crime cases in the state's history. Case 7. April 2021, Las Vegas. In a crime that shocked the community and gained national attention, Sierra Halseth, a teenager, conspired with her boyfriend to kill her father, Daniel Halseth. After brutally stabbing and setting him on fire, the couple was seen in a disturbing video, laughing and joking about the murder while documenting their escape. The lack of remorse and cold detachment from reality captured on camera became a chilling centerpiece of the investigation and eventual sentencing. What began as a family conflict over a forbidden relationship ended in one of Nevada's most disturbing domestic murder cases. The attack was triggered by escalating tensions between Sierra and her father over her relationship with her boyfriend. Daniel Halseth, a former Nevada state senator, had grown increasingly concerned about the influence of Sierra's boyfriend and had taken steps to separate the two, including limiting contact and enforcing strict boundaries at home. On the day of the murder, the couple carried out a premeditated attack, stabbing Daniel multiple times before setting fire to the home in an attempt to destroy evidence. The body was discovered after the fire department responded to the blaze. By then, Sierra and her boyfriend had already fled the scene. Daniel Halseth was a well-known figure in Nevada politics, respected for his past role as a state senator and known as a devoted father. He had recently expressed concerns about his daughter's well-being and her increasingly rebellious behavior. Friends and family described Daniel as strict but protective. His objection to the relationship was rooted in fear for Sierra's safety and emotional health. The murder shattered a family and ignited conversations about teen relationships, manipulation, and the limits of parental control. The betrayal by his own daughter added another layer of horror to an already tragic case. Police quickly uncovered evidence pointing to premeditation. Surveillance footage captured the couple purchasing cleaning supplies and other items shortly before the crime. Most damning was a video on Sierra's phone, recorded after the murder, showing her and her boyfriend laughing in a car about their actions, making flippant remarks, and mocking the situation. Digital evidence also included text messages and search history indicating plans to flee. The confessional nature of the footage and its casual tone were central to the case. Detectives described the video as one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence they had ever seen. The couple was apprehended in Salt Lake City, Utah, several days after the murder. They were traveling by train and had dyed their hair to alter their appearance. Both were arrested without incident and extradited back to Nevada. Charges included murder, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and evidence tampering. Prosecutors emphasized the methodical planning and callous aftermath as aggravating factors. Despite their young age, both were tried as adults. The defense attempted to argue coercion and immaturity, but the overwhelming evidence, including the confession video, left little room for mitigation. In 2022, Sierra Halseth was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Her boyfriend received the same sentence. The video, described by the judge as haunting and dehumanizing, was instrumental in the court's decision. During sentencing, members of Daniel Halseth's family spoke of the pain, betrayal, and irreversible damage caused by Sierra's actions. The case continues to be cited in discussions around juvenile justice, psychological manipulation, and the dangers of unchecked teen relationships. It remains one of the most high-profile parricide cases in recent U.S. history. Case 8. March 2015, Wisconsin. 17-year-old Ashley Martinson shot her mother and stepfather inside their rural home, then locked herself in her bedroom for hours before fleeing the state. The case gained widespread attention due to her online identity as a horror blogger who wrote violent fiction under the pseudonym Vampchick. The contrast between her creative persona and her real-life crime drew national interest. When investigators examined her digital history, they found writing that eerily mirrored the method and tone of the murders she would later commit. According to Ashley, the killing stemmed from years of mistreatment and fear. She later told investigators that her stepfather was controlling and abusive, and that her mother allowed the behavior to continue. On the morning of March 7, an argument escalated, and Ashley retrieved a shotgun from the family's collection. She shot her stepfather in the chest and face, then turned the weapon on her mother. Afterward, she locked her younger sisters in a bedroom to shield them from the scene, left food and water, and fled the house. Prosecutors later described her actions as deliberate and calculated, not impulsive. Ashley's writings painted a disturbing portrait of her inner world. Her horror blog contained short stories about revenge, blood, and escape, with protagonists often seeking freedom through violence. Friends and classmates recalled that she had withdrawn in the months leading up to the crime. Her stepfather, identified as Thomas Ayers, was a former truck driver with a reputation for strict discipline. Investigators later found evidence supporting Ashley's claims of household tension, including prior reports of domestic disturbances. The relationship between Ashley and her parents had been fractured by fear, resentment, and isolation long before the killings occurred. Following the shootings, Ashley fled to Indiana with her 22-year-old boyfriend. The two were located the next day after authorities traced her cell phone. Police arrested her without resistance at a friend's home. In her possession were notebooks, phone records, and a laptop containing her horror stories. Digital forensics confirmed the authorship of her violent posts, some of which had been written just days before the murders. These writings became key pieces of evidence for prosecutors, establishing a mindset of anger and fantasy-driven revenge. Her case drew comparisons to fictional narratives of teenage rebellion that blurred the line between art and reality. Martinson accepted a plea deal to avoid trial, pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree intentional homicide. Prosecutors acknowledged her claims of abuse but argued that the crime was premeditated. The plea spared her from a possible life sentence. During sentencing, she appeared calm and detached, speaking only briefly about her motives. She expressed that she had lived in fear and felt trapped in her home environment. Psychological evaluations described her as intelligent and remorseful but emotionally stunted, shaped by prolonged trauma and fantasy escapism. The judge described the case as a tragedy born from abuse and obsession. Ashley Martinson was sentenced to 23 years in prison followed by 17 years of supervision. In interviews conducted later, she stated that prison had brought her stability and safety, feelings she said she had never experienced at home. Her words reignited debate about the intersection of trauma, accountability, and youth violence. The case remains a grim example of how chronic domestic abuse and unchecked emotional distress can lead to catastrophic acts of retaliation. In Wisconsin criminal history, Martinson's story stands as a modern cautionary tale about the thin boundary between imagination and reality. Case 9. In October 2016, Georgia police responded to a report that would soon unravel into a confession. 17-year-old Dakota White led officers to the body of his friend, Sam Poss, after admitting he had killed him. The revelation followed an interrogation in which White described wanting to know what it felt like to take a life. Investigators treated the admission as central to the case, citing it as evidence that the killing was not accidental. The community confronted a new and unsettling reality. The defendant had stated curiosity as a motive. Poss's body was located where White indicated, and forensic teams recorded multiple stab wounds to the neck and torso. The scene showed signs of a brief struggle, but no prolonged attempt at concealment. White had indicated the location and guided officers to the exact spot, reducing initial uncertainty about the victim's disposition. Medical examiners established a clear cause of death consistent with the wounds observed. Poss's identity and the immediate circumstances left investigators with a direct trail from confession to physical evidence, framing the inquiry that would follow. Sam Poss had been known to White as an acquaintance and friend within a shared social circle. Those who knew Poss described him as trying to build stability after recent life changes, and not prone to confrontations. White and Poss had interacted in school and neighborhood settings, sometimes casually but without documented conflict. The apparent absence of a sustained motive beyond White's expressed curiosity made the case particularly difficult for friends to reconcile. The victim's family later emphasized Poss's plans and potential, underscoring the senselessness of his loss. Investigators secured White's voluntary cooperation and followed leads that corroborated his account. White guided police to the scene, identified the weapon's likely disposal area, and described the sequence of events leading to the attack. Forensic technicians recovered blood evidence consistent with White's statements and matched trace materials to clothing found in his possession. Digital forensics reviewed recent communications and behavior patterns. While no extended plotting was evident, the totality of material aligned with White's confession and the physical record at the scene. Each finding narrowed the gap between admission and proof. White was taken into custody without resistance after directing officers to the location. During subsequent interviews, he elaborated on his motive, describing a desire to experience the act of killing. Prosecutors used his on-scene cooperation and detailed statements as foundational elements of their case. Defense counsel later sought to challenge aspects of the interrogation and to present background evidence regarding White's upbringing and mental state. Nonetheless, the combination of a direct confession and corroborating forensic evidence produced a decisive prosecutorial narrative. In 2018, A jury convicted White of first-degree murder. The court imposed a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, citing the deliberate nature of the act and the defendant's own account of motive. Appeals and post-conviction challenges were subsequently heard, but in 2020, the conviction and sentence were upheld by higher courts. The case was characterized in legal reviews as a prototypical example of a confession-driven prosecution, in which the defendants expressed intent eliminated reasonable doubt about premeditation. For the victim's community, the outcome offered finality but no comfort. Case 10. Sep 2012, West Virginia. In a remote, quiet part of the state, 16-year-old Joseph Spencer committed an act that left his community reeling. Inside the family's modest home, Spencer murdered his parents and younger sister in what authorities later described as a calculated yet emotionless attack. Neighbors were stunned. There had been no warnings, no history of violence or mental illness. The teenager waited for police to arrive, offering no resistance. When questioned, he admitted everything. Responding officers entered the residence to a grim scene. All three victims, Spencer's mother, father, and 12-year-old sister, were found dead from gunshot wounds. Joseph Spencer had called 911 himself and remained on the scene when authorities arrived. No external signs of forced entry or struggle were evident. The firearm was recovered at the scene. In initial interviews, Spencer stated he had simply decided to kill his family that day, offering no specific reason. The Spencer family was known locally as kind and reserved. They lived in a rural area with limited contact outside of school and work. Teachers described Joseph as quiet, with average grades and no disciplinary issues. There were no reports of abuse or neglect in the household. The killings shocked even law enforcement due to the lack of any prior signs. The absence of motive deepened the mystery. The community mourned not just the loss, but the senselessness of the act. Spencer offered a full confession at the scene. He waived his right to an attorney during initial questioning and detailed the timeline of the killings. Investigators found no drugs, alcohol, or signs of external coercion. The murder weapon belonged to his father and had been kept in a locked case, which Joseph had apparently accessed prior to the killings. Forensic analysis confirmed his account. Psychological evaluations showed no evidence of psychosis or delusions. Prosecutors charged Joseph Spencer as an adult due to the severity of the crime and his age at the time. His defense did not contest the facts, but attempted to argue for mental health treatment instead of a standard prison sentence. The court denied that motion. There was no plea bargain. The trial was brief. Jurors were shown video footage of the confession and evidence from the scene. The case concluded within months of the murders. Joseph Spencer was convicted on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, Spencer offered no apology, remaining silent throughout. The families of the victims, distant relatives and friends, attended the hearing in tears. The court noted the absence of remorse. The case has remained largely unknown outside the state, a chilling reminder of the potential for violence where it is least expected. Case 1. July 2009, New York City. Ben Novick Jr., a hotel heir tied to one of America's most recognizable luxury brands, was found murdered inside a high-end hotel suite. The scene initially appeared consistent with a robbery gone wrong. Ben lay dead, and his wife, Narcy Novick, was discovered nearby claiming she had been restrained by intruders. At first glance, the narrative suggested an external attack. However, investigators noted irregularities almost immediately. Within a short period, attention shifted away from unknown assailants and toward the person who had been closest to the victim, his wife. Ben Novick Jr.'s body was discovered inside the couple's hotel room after Narcy Novick alerted authorities, reporting that intruders had entered the suite during the night. She claimed she had been bound and assaulted while her husband was attacked. Police arrived to find Ben deceased and Narcy restrained in the hallway. Despite the violent outcome, the scene showed no evidence of forced entry. The hotel room was largely undisturbed, and valuables remained in place. Security logs showed no suspicious movement consistent with a break-in. These inconsistencies raised immediate concern. Investigators noted that the physical evidence did not align with the account being presented. Ben Novick Jr. was the son of Bernice Novick and heir to the Fontainebleau hotel fortune, a name associated with wealth, prestige, and legacy. He lived a lifestyle shaped by inherited assets rather than independent business success. His marriage to Narcy Novick had been marked by increasing tension in the months before his death. Financial disagreements and discussions of divorce had reportedly become frequent. According to records later introduced in court, a divorce would have significantly reduced Narcy's access to Ben's wealth. The couple's relationship, once publicly polished, had deteriorated behind closed doors. It would take only days for their private conflict to become the focus of a homicide investigation. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline using hotel surveillance footage, phone records, and financial documents. Video evidence showed no unknown individuals entering or exiting the suite during the relevant time frame. Narcy's bindings were examined and determined to be loosely applied, inconsistent with a violent restraint. Phone records revealed recent communications between Narcy and individuals later identified as hired attackers. Financial transactions showed payments that aligned with those contacts. Investigators also identified prior attempts by Narcy to solicit violence against her husband. The cumulative evidence suggested that the scene had been staged to simulate a robbery rather than reflect one. Authorities identified and arrested the men responsible for physically carrying out the attack. Under questioning, they admitted their involvement and provided details about their coordination with Narcy Novick. Records confirmed payments and communication linking her directly to the planning of the murder. As investigators expanded the scope of the case, they revisited a prior death in the family. In April 2009, Ben's mother, Bernice Novick, had died under circumstances originally ruled accidental. A renewed forensic review revealed injuries inconsistent with a fall. Evidence placed Narcy and her associates near Bernice's residence shortly before her death, shifting the case from spousal homicide to a broader conspiracy. In 2012, Narcy Novick was convicted in New York for the murder of Ben Novick Jr. and the earlier killing of Bernice Novick. Prosecutors presented the case as a calculated effort to secure financial control by eliminating both the heir and his mother. The jury agreed. Narcy Novick was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She continued to deny responsibility, but the convictions closed one of the most methodical domestic murder cases in recent history. The verdict left no ambiguity in the court's conclusion, though the motive remains debated by investigators. Case 2. August 2014, California. Robert Lyman was found shot to death at the rail yard where he worked, a location familiar to him and routine in his daily life. The discovery shocked coworkers and prompted an immediate law enforcement response. His wife, Sabrina Lyman, publicly mourned his death, attending vigils and speaking about loss and faith. To the outside world, she appeared to be a grieving spouse struggling to process sudden violence. Investigators, however, began quietly examining her recent behavior and private communications, noting details that did not align with a random workplace attack. Robert Lyman's body was discovered by coworkers inside the rail yard during regular operating hours. Emergency services were contacted, and responding officers found that he had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. The location initially suggested a targeted ambush related to his job, and the case was briefly treated as a workplace. Related homicide. There were no immediate suspects, and no weapon was found at the scene. Surveillance coverage in the area was limited, complicating early efforts to identify a shooter. Sabrina Lyman was notified and arrived shortly after, presenting herself as cooperative and composed. Yet investigators noted the absence of forced confrontation indicators typically associated with an external attack. The scene offered few answers, and the physical evidence did not clearly support the initial theory. Robert Lyman was known as a reliable employee and family-oriented individual with an established routine. He was married to Sabrina and shared a home life that appeared stable to friends and neighbors. Financially, the couple was not affluent, but they maintained insurance policies and shared long-term plans. Unbeknownst to many in their social circle, Sabrina had entered a secret relationship with another man. Records later showed that she stood to benefit financially from Robert's death through life insurance payouts. The contrast between Robert's predictable lifestyle and Sabrina's hidden relationship created a narrative investigator could not ignore. It would take only days for their private lives to become central to the investigation. Detectives began reviewing phone records and digital communications connected to both Robert and Sabrina. They discovered frequent contact between Sabrina and a man named Jonathan Hearn in the months leading up to the murder. When questioned, Sabrina described the relationship as a friendship. Investigators also uncovered evidence suggesting an earlier attempt to poison Robert, an incident previously believed to be accidental illness. Statements provided by Sabrina shifted over time, introducing inconsistencies that raised suspicion. The emerging timeline indicated preparation rather than impulse. Each discovery reduced the likelihood of a spontaneous act and strengthened the theory of a coordinated plan. Jonathan Hearn was brought in for questioning after investigators confirmed his connection to Sabrina. Under sustained pressure, he admitted to shooting Robert Lyman. He stated that Sabrina had portrayed her husband as abusive and dangerous, claiming she feared for her safety. Further questioning revealed that Sabrina had encouraged and guided the plan, framing the killing as necessary for a shared future. Phone data and messages corroborated Jonathan's account. Authorities concluded that the shooting was not a crime of passion, but the final step in a deliberate conspiracy. Sabrina Lyman was arrested and charged based on this evidence. In 2017, Sabrina Lyman stood trial for first-degree murder and conspiracy. Prosecutors presented digital records, financial motives, and testimony from Jonathan Hearn to establish intent and planning. The jury rejected claims that she had been misled or coerced. She was convicted on all major charges and sentenced to life in prison. Jonathan Hearn received a reduced sentence after cooperating with authorities. Sabrina showed little outward reaction as the verdict was read. The case concluded with a clear legal outcome, though it left unresolved questions about how long the planning had been underway before Robert Lyman's death. Case 3. December 2000, Florida. Mike Williams disappeared during what was supposed to be a routine duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole. When he failed to return home, concern quickly turned into a search operation. His absence was treated as an unfortunate outdoor accident rather than a crime. With no body recovered and no immediate evidence of foul play, authorities concluded that Mike had likely drowned. The case appeared resolved. For years, it remained a closed chapter, quietly accepted by the community. That conclusion would stand unchallenged for 16 years, until new events forced investigators to reconsider what had really happened on the lake. Search teams later located Mike Williams's boat floating empty near the reeds. Inside, his shotgun and personal items were found undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no indication of violence. Wildlife experts suggested that if Mike had fallen into the water, alligators could have removed any remains. Without a body, investigators lacked the evidence required to pursue a homicide inquiry. Denise Williams reported her husband missing and cooperated with authorities. The incident was classified as a presumed accidental drowning. The absence of physical proof closed investigative paths, leaving only speculation. Officially, Mike Williams had vanished due to a tragic accident, and the case was shelved. Mike Williams was known as a dependable husband, a devoted father, and a stable provider. He worked consistently and maintained a routine centered on family and community involvement. His marriage to Denise Williams appeared conventional, but records later revealed a different reality. Denise was financially dependent on Mike and had taken out multiple life insurance policies in his name. Evidence would later show she had also begun planning a future that did not include him. While Mike believed he was maintaining a stable household, Denise was cultivating a relationship with his close friend, Brian Winchester. It would take only days for this hidden dynamic to become critical to the investigation. The case remained dormant until 2016, when Denise Williams was kidnapped at gunpoint by Brian Winchester. She survived the incident, but the crime drew renewed attention to their relationship. Investigators questioned why her husband's former best friend would commit such an act unless deeper ties existed. During the kidnapping investigation, detectives revisited Mike Williams's disappearance. Inconsistencies in prior statements and the financial arrangements surrounding the life insurance policies raised concern. Brian Winchester faced serious charges and potential prison time. Under mounting pressure, he began providing information that challenged the long-standing assumption that Mike's death had been accidental. Brian Winchester eventually confessed that Mike Williams had not drowned. He detailed a plan devised with Denise Williams to eliminate her husband. According to his account, he lured Mike onto the lake under the pretense of a hunting trip. When Mike realized something was wrong and attempted to escape, Brian shot him. He then disposed of the body in a remote area. Brian stated that Denise had orchestrated the plan, motivated by insurance money and the promise of a shared future. His confession was supported by financial records and corroborating evidence. Denise Williams was arrested and charged in connection with the murder. In 2019, Denise Williams was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Prosecutors presented Brian Winchester's testimony alongside financial documentation and behavioral evidence. The jury found that the disappearance had been a calculated act rather than an accident. Denise was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian Winchester received a separate sentence for his role in the crime. The case closed nearly 2 decades after Mike Williams vanished, ending a long-held assumption of accidental death. The motive behind the killing, however, continues to be examined by investigators. Case 4. July 2023, Bahamas. Authorities reviewing digital evidence during an unrelated investigation intercepted a message that would immediately alter the course of a criminal inquiry. The message, brief and direct, allegedly ordered the murder of former NFL player Robert Shiver. At the time, Robert was not reported missing or injured. The message did not surface through a domestic complaint or a welfare check. Instead, it appeared incidentally, embedded within data seized for a separate crime. What investigators uncovered suggested that a violent plan had been initiated before any physical harm occurred. The message was discovered during a burglary investigation conducted by Bahamian police. While searching a suspect's mobile device for evidence related to the theft, officers encountered text exchanges referencing a planned killing. The content included names, locations, and timing that raised immediate concern. Authorities determined that the intended target was Robert Shiver, who was present in the Bahamas at the time. The language of the message indicated intent rather than fantasy or exaggeration. Investigators halted the burglary inquiry and escalated the matter, notifying senior officials and coordinating with international partners. The discovery marked the transition from property crime to a suspected conspiracy to commit murder. Robert Shiver was married to Lindsay Shiver, and the couple had been experiencing significant marital conflict. Records later showed disputes involving infidelity allegations, public humiliation, and escalating tension. Lindsay was reportedly involved in an extramarital relationship, and the exposure of that affair intensified the breakdown of the marriage. Divorce proceedings carried substantial financial consequences, including asset division and custody considerations. Investigators later noted that Robert's continued presence complicated those outcomes. The relationship had shifted from private conflict to legal vulnerability, creating circumstances where separation carried measurable financial and personal costs. Authorities began recovering digital communications linked to the intercepted message. Phone records, messaging applications, and location data were analyzed to establish context and intent. Investigators identified multiple individuals communicating about the plan and traced coordination across devices. Bahamian law enforcement worked alongside U.S. authorities to assess jurisdiction and evidentiary standards. Digital forensics confirmed the timing and origin of the messages. Investigators also reviewed travel records and financial transactions to determine whether preparations had moved beyond communication. The collected data suggested planning activity rather than spontaneous expression, prompting immediate intervention to prevent further escalation. Lindsay Shiver was arrested along with alleged co-conspirators after authorities determined there was sufficient cause to believe a murder plot had been initiated. The arrests were made before any physical attack occurred. Investigators stated that the evidence supported charges of conspiracy to commit murder. Each individual was taken into custody and formally charged under Bahamian law. The case drew international attention due to the public profile of the individuals involved and the nature of the evidence. The arrest marked the disruption of the alleged plan before it could be carried out. Legal proceedings remain ongoing. Lindsay Shiver has entered a plea of not guilty and has been released under court-imposed conditions while awaiting trial. Prosecutors have indicated that, if convicted, she could face a sentence of up to 60 years in prison. The case continues to move through the judicial system, with hearings focused on admissibility of digital evidence and jurisdictional authority. No final verdict has been reached. As proceedings continue, the outcome remains unresolved, and the alleged motive remains under examination by investigators. Case 5. June 2021, Iowa. Ryan Cooper was shot and killed inside his own home during what should have been an ordinary evening. When emergency responders arrived, they found Ryan fatally wounded, while his wife, Karina Cooper, was physically unharmed. There were no immediate signs of a struggle and no indication that an unknown intruder had forced entry into the residence. The killing appeared sudden and contained, raising early questions about how an attacker could have entered and exited without detection. From the beginning, investigators noted that the circumstances did not align with a random act of violence. Police responded to a report of a homicide at the Cooper residence and secured the scene. Ryan Cooper was pronounced dead after suffering gunshot wounds to the head. Officers found no broken doors or windows, and the home showed no signs of forced entry. Valuables were untouched, and there was no evidence of a burglary attempt. Karina Cooper told authorities that she had no knowledge of who could have committed the crime. The lack of physical disruption suggested the shooter had either been allowed inside or was already present. This detail immediately shifted the focus of the investigation toward individuals with close access to the victim. Ryan Cooper had been married to Karina for several years, but records later showed the relationship had deteriorated significantly. Friends and family described growing tension between the couple, particularly related to finances and personal conflict. Investigators discovered that Ryan held multiple life insurance policies, with Karina listed as the primary beneficiary. In addition, digital evidence later revealed that Karina had been involved in a secret relationship with another man. The combination of marital strain, financial incentive, and an undisclosed relationship formed a context that investigators could not ignore. It would take only days for these factors to become central to the case. Detectives began examining digital communications and financial records connected to Karina Cooper. Messages recovered from social media and messaging platforms revealed ongoing contact between Karina and a man later identified as the shooter. Forensic experts analyzed the crime scene and determined that the trajectory of the bullets was consistent with shots fired from inside the home rather than from a forced entry point. Timing analysis of phone data placed Karina in contact with the shooter shortly before and after Ryan's death. The evidence suggested coordination rather than coincidence, reinforcing the theory that the killing had been planned. Authorities arrested the individual identified as the shooter, who later provided information implicating Karina Cooper. Communication records, including messages and call logs, established a connection between the two that extended beyond casual contact. Prosecutors argued that Karina had facilitated the crime by providing access and direction. The evidence presented showed a clear sequence of planning, execution, and financial benefit. Based on this information, Karina Cooper was charged and ultimately convicted for her role in orchestrating the murder. The case moved forward without evidence supporting an alternative suspect or accidental explanation. In 2025, Karina Cooper was found guilty of murder following a jury trial. Prosecutors outlined the financial motive, digital coordination, and forensic findings linking her to the crime. She now faces an anticipated life sentence under Iowa law. In parallel, Ryan Cooper's family initiated legal action to recover life insurance proceeds paid out after his death, citing statutes that prevent individuals from benefiting financially from crimes they commit. Karina Cooper remains in custody as sentencing proceedings continue. The case concluded with a clear legal determination, though financial disputes related to the aftermath remain unresolved. Case 6. October 1999, Texas. Stephen Beard, a retired television executive and millionaire, was shot while sleeping in his home in Austin. The attack occurred late at night, inside a residence believed to be secure and private. Stephen survived the initial shooting but sustained severe injuries that would later prove fatal. At the time, his wife, Celeste Beard Johnson, reported the incident as a burglary gone wrong. The explanation suggested an unknown intruder had entered the home and fled without being identified. From the outset, however, investigators questioned why a burglary would result in violence without theft. Police responded to the residence after receiving reports of a shooting. Stephen Beard was found wounded by a shotgun blast while seated in a recliner. Despite the violent entry implied by the report, investigators found no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact, and no valuables appeared to be missing. The home showed no evidence of ransacking. The absence of stolen property conflicted with the burglary narrative. Stephen was transported to the hospital, where he underwent extensive medical treatment. Although he survived the initial attack, complications from his injuries would later contribute to his death, prompting authorities to reevaluate the nature of the crime. Stephen Beard had married Celeste Beard Johnson several years earlier, despite a significant age difference. He was in his 70s, financially secure, and had incorporated Celeste into his estate planning. Celeste, decades younger, gained access to wealth and assets following the marriage. Records later revealed she had expressed dissatisfaction with the relationship and financial arrangements. During this period, Celeste developed a relationship with Tracy Tarleton while receiving treatment at a rehabilitation facility. Investigators later concluded that this relationship extended beyond emotional support. It would take only days for these personal dynamics to emerge as critical elements of the case. As investigators searched for leads, attention turned to Tracy Tarleton. Under questioning, Tracy confessed to firing the shotgun that injured Stephen Beard. She stated that she had acted under the influence and direction of Celeste Beard Johnson. According to her account, Celeste had repeatedly portrayed Stephen as controlling and abusive, encouraging Tracy to believe the shooting was necessary. Tracy described months of emotional manipulation that framed the act as justified. Her confession shifted the investigation from an unknown intruder scenario to a planned act involving close personal relationships. Authorities reviewed financial records, communication logs, and witness statements to determine the extent of Celeste's involvement. Evidence showed Celeste stood to gain significantly from Stephen Beard's death. Testimony and documentation supported the claim that she had orchestrated the plan while positioning Tracy as the sole perpetrator. Investigators concluded that Celeste had intentionally manipulated events to distance herself from direct involvement. The evidence established that she was not a passive participant, but the primary planner behind the shooting. Celeste Beard Johnson was arrested and charged with murder. Celeste Beard Johnson was tried and convicted for her role in Stephen Beard's death. Prosecutors presented the case as a deliberate effort to secure financial gain through manipulation and violence. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Tracy Tarleton received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. Stephen Beard died months after the shooting due to complications related to his injuries. The case concluded with a clear determination of responsibility, though Celeste has continued to deny wrongdoing. The conviction remains one of the most closely examined examples of orchestrated domestic homicide. Case 7. February 2018, Connecticut. A welfare check intended to locate a missing university professor led authorities to a discovery hidden inside his own home. Dr. Pierluigi Bigazzi, a respected pathologist, had not been seen for months, prompting concern from colleagues. When officers entered the residence, they did not find a man who had quietly relocated or fallen ill. Instead, they uncovered evidence that his disappearance had been deliberately concealed. The missing professor was not gone at all. He had been hidden beneath the same roof he once shared with his wife. The welfare check was requested after Dr. Bigazzi failed to appear for work and stopped communicating with his employer. Police arrived at the couple's home and received no response. After gaining entry, they found the house orderly, with no immediate signs of distress. It was only after a deeper search that officers located human remains concealed in the basement. The condition of the body indicated that death had occurred months earlier. During that time, no missing person report had been filed. The prolonged silence raised immediate questions about how the death had gone unnoticed and unreported for so long. Dr. Bigazzi had built a long academic career, serving as a professor and medical examiner known for his expertise in pathology. His professional life involved determining causes of death, a fact not lost on investigators. He was married to Linda Casuta Bigazzi, and the couple shared financial accounts tied to his employment. Records later showed that following his death, regular income deposits continued into their joint accounts. Bills were paid on time, and daily life appeared uninterrupted. The financial connection between the couple became central to understanding why his disappearance had not been reported. It would take only days for this financial trail to become critical evidence. Investigators conducted forensic examinations to establish the cause and approximate time of death. Due to decomposition and concealment, precise timing was difficult to determine, but evidence confirmed the death was not recent. Financial records revealed that Linda continued using funds generated after Dr. Bigazzi's death, including paychecks and benefits. There was no evidence of outside intrusion or third-party involvement. The concealment itself demonstrated intentional action. Combined forensic and financial findings supported the conclusion that the death had been hidden to allow continued access to money. Linda Casuta Bigazzi was arrested and charged after investigators concluded that she had caused her husband's death and concealed it for financial benefit. Prosecutors filed charges including first-degree manslaughter and first-degree larceny. The case did not rely on eyewitness accounts, but on documented financial activity, physical evidence, and the absence of any alternative explanation. Authorities stated that the prolonged concealment and continued financial use were central to the charges. The arrest marked the first public acknowledgement that the disappearance had been a crime rather than neglect or accident. In 2024, Linda Kasuta Bigatsi entered a guilty plea to the charges filed against her. The plea confirmed the state's position that she had caused her husband's death and benefited financially from concealing it. A full trial was avoided, and sentencing was scheduled for a later date. The academic community formally acknowledged Dr. Bigatsi's death following the plea. While the legal process moved toward conclusion, questions regarding motive and the precise circumstances of the death remained unresolved. The case closed quietly, defined less by violence than by deliberate silence. Case 8. 2018, Georgia. Gary Ferris disappeared from the rural property he shared with his wife, Melody Ferris. No report was immediately filed and no urgent search followed. Melody told friends and relatives that Gary had left on his own, suggesting he needed time away or had chosen to walk out of the marriage. In a quiet rural setting where privacy was common, the explanation initially went unchallenged. Months passed, then years, with no confirmed sightings or contact. What appeared to be a voluntary disappearance would later be reclassified as something far more deliberate. Gary Ferris's absence stretched on without resolution until investigators renewed interest in the case. A search of the property was eventually conducted after inconsistencies emerged in Melody Ferris's accounts. During that search, authorities discovered human remains within a burn pile on the land. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Gary. The condition of the bones indicated exposure to extreme heat, suggesting an attempt to destroy evidence rather than conceal a body intact. The discovery ended years of uncertainty and shifted the case from a missing person inquiry to a homicide investigation. Gary Ferris had lived a modest life, working and maintaining the rural property where he resided with Melody. Records and witness statements later showed the marriage had been strained by ongoing financial difficulties. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Melody had been involved in an extramarital relationship during the period leading up to Gary's disappearance. The combination of financial pressure and personal conflict provided context for the breakdown of the relationship. What had been described as a quiet domestic arrangement was revealed to be marked by instability. It would take only days for these factors to become central to the prosecution's theory. Forensic teams conducted a detailed examination of the property, focusing on areas that could have been used to conceal or destroy Evie. Dense, ballistic analysis indicated Gary had been shot before his body was burned. Investigators found no evidence supporting Melody's claim that Gary had left voluntarily. Digital records, witness statements, and physical evidence contradicted her explanations. The absence of any travel activity, financial use, or communication from Gary following his disappearance further undermined the narrative of a self-imposed absence. Each finding narrowed the scope of the investigation toward a single suspect. Melody Ferris was arrested after investigators concluded the evidence established her responsibility for Gary's death. Prosecutors relied on ballistic findings, forensic recovery of remains, and testimony regarding her behavior after his disappearance. During legal proceedings, Melody attempted to deflect blame, suggesting that her own son was responsible. Authorities rejected this claim, citing lack of supporting evidence. The prosecution presented a consistent timeline showing motive, opportunity, and concealment. The arrest marked the end of years of uncertainty surrounding Gary Ferris's disappearance. In 2024, Melody Ferris was convicted of murder and related charges. The court sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The verdict concluded a case that had remained unresolved for years due to delayed reporting and concealment of evidence. Gary Ferris was formally acknowledged as a homicide victim rather than a missing person. While the sentence provided legal closure, the circumstances surrounding the years-long concealment continued to raise questions about how the disappearance went unchallenged for so long. Case 9. January 2017, Los Angeles. Fabio Cementilli was found murdered behind his own home in the Woodland Hills neighborhood. He had suffered multiple stab wounds and was pronounced dead at the scene. The discovery stunned family members, neighbors, and colleagues who knew him as a successful executive in the beauty industry. Police initially approached the scene as a possible home invasion, noting signs that suggested an intruder had entered the property. At first glance, the attack appeared sudden and external. However, details surrounding the location, timing, and circumstances of the killing quickly raised doubts about that initial assumption. Investigators observed what appeared to be signs of forced entry, leading to an early theory of robbery. Items from the home were reported missing, reinforcing that narrative. Fabio's wife, Monica Cementilli, was not present at the time of the attack and later described shock and grief. The crime scene suggested violence but lacked clear indicators of a struggle extending beyond the victim. Surveillance coverage in the area was limited, and no immediate suspects were identified. Despite the robbery theory, detectives noted that the staging appeared selective. Only Fabio had been targeted, and the supposed theft lacked follow-up activity, prompting closer scrutiny of the circumstances. Fabio Cementilli had built a public career marked by visibility and professional success. He was widely known in the beauty industry and maintained an active social presence. His marriage to Monica appeared stable in public, with the couple frequently attending events together. Privately, investigators later uncovered evidence that the relationship was strained. Monica had been involved in a long-term extramarital relationship that had not been disclosed to Fabio. Financial records showed that Fabio carried substantial life insurance policies, with Monica positioned to benefit significantly. The contrast between public stability and private deception became central to understanding the case. As the investigation progressed, detectives examined phone records and financial documents connected to Monica Cementilli. They identified extensive communication between Monica and a man later identified as her romantic partner. Timing analysis showed contact before and after the murder. Financial records demonstrated a clear monetary benefit tied to Fabio's death. Items reported stolen were never recovered or used, undermining the robbery narrative. Investigators concluded that the forced entry appearance had been staged. Each layer of evidence weakened the original theory and pointed instead toward a coordinated plan involving someone close to the victim. Authorities determined that Monica Cementilli and her romantic partner had coordinated the attack. Evidence showed planning, communication, and shared intent leading up to the murder. Her partner was arrested and charged, and further investigation established Monica's role in facilitating the crime. Prosecutors argued that she had provided access, timing, and motive. The case moved forward on the basis that the killing was not spontaneous but orchestrated. The evidence demonstrated cooperation rather than coercion, leading to charges that reflected deliberate involvement rather than passive association. In 2025, Monica Cementilli was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The jury rejected claims that she had been unaware of the plan or manipulated by others. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Fabio Cementilli's family addressed the court, emphasizing the betrayal involved in the crime. The conviction brought legal closure to a case that had unfolded over several years. While the verdict resolved the question of responsibility, it left enduring questions about how trust had been exploited within a marriage that appeared stable to the outside world. Case 10. June 2024, Canterbury, England. Jeremy Rickards was reported missing by his wife, Maureen Rickards, after he failed to make contact with family members. She told relatives that he had left to clear his head and suggested he may have traveled abroad. The report did not initially trigger an urgent response. Jeremy had no immediate travel records, but there was no evidence at that stage to contradict the account. For several days, the disappearance remained a concern rather than a crime, until authorities expanded their search to the couple's property. Police conducted a search of the Rickards' residence after inconsistencies emerged in the timeline provided. In the back garden, officers located a large zippered storage bag concealed among shrubs. Inside were human remains later identified as Jeremy Rickards. Forensic assessment showed the body had been concealed for weeks, not days. The discovery immediately contradicted the missing person narrative. Evidence indicated the body had been deliberately hidden on the property rather than disposed of elsewhere. The case shifted from disappearance to homicide at the moment the remains were recovered. Jeremy Rickards had lived largely isolated in the months leading up to his death. Records and witness statements referenced a history of domestic conflict within the marriage, including allegations of abuse and control. Jeremy did not seek formal protection or report incidents to authorities. Investigators later noted patterns consistent with social withdrawal and dependency. His isolation limited external oversight of his well-being. These circumstances provided context for how his absence went initially unquestioned, and how prolonged concealment became possible within a private domestic setting. Forensic pathology established the cause of death as a combination of stabbing and strangulation. Entomological analysis determined insect activity, inconsistent with the timeline provided by Moore and Rickards. Temperature patterns and decomposition stages confirmed the body had been concealed significantly earlier than reported. Bloodstain analysis inside the home revealed signs of a struggle that had been cleaned. Each forensic finding directly contradicted the account of a recent disappearance. Investigators concluded that the narrative presented after Jeremy was reported missing had been deliberately constructed. Moore and Rickards was arrested after forensic evidence eliminated alternative explanations. Authorities cited contradictions between her statements and scientific findings as decisive. There was no evidence supporting accidental death or third-party involvement. The combination of pathology, entomology, and scene analysis established intent and concealment. The arrest followed formal review of the forensic timeline and reconstruction of events. Investigators stated that the evidence formed a complete and consistent account that could not be reconciled with Moore and Rickards' claims. In 2025, Moore and Rickards was convicted of murder following a jury trial. The court imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 24 years before eligibility for parole. The judge noted the deliberate concealment of the body and the sustained deception following Jeremy Rickards' death. The verdict concluded the case with a definitive legal outcome. While the sentence addressed accountability, the prolonged concealment and initial misdirection remained central features of the case, underscoring how forensic science ultimately exposed the false timeline. Case 1. On September 2, 2019, in Elkmont, Alabama, deputies responded to a home where 5 members of the Sisk family were found dead from gunshot wounds. 14-year-old Mason Sisk, the only surviving son, reported that an unknown intruder had entered the residence and opened fire. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when they examined the exterior and noted that all entry points were intact. Within days, attention turned toward Mason as inconsistencies surfaced in his account. The case began in the early morning hours when a 911 call was placed reporting a shooting inside the Sisk residence. Deputies arrived at approximately 11:00 p.m. and found 5 victims: the father, the stepmother, and 3 young siblings. No signs of forced entry were documented, and the layout of the scene indicated the gunfire originated entirely within the home. Mason told responding deputies that he had been in the basement playing video games when he heard shots and observed an intruder fleeing in a vehicle. The statement prompted an initial canvass of the surrounding area, but no suspicious individuals or vehicles were located. As investigators reconstructed the scene, the trajectory patterns and intact doors created doubts about the reported escape route. But the evidence at the scene didn't match the initial story. The victims included 38-year-old John Sisk, his wife Mary Sisk, and their 3 children, all under the age of 15. Relatives later reported long-standing household tensions and frequent arguments between family members, noting that the environment had become increasingly strained in recent months. John Sisk worked locally and maintained limited community ties, while Mary oversaw the household and the children's routines. Extended relatives described disruptions in the home dynamic that had caused concern, but had not led to formal intervention. Mason, who had alternated between biological and blended family homes during childhood, lived under rules that some relatives said created friction. The family maintained limited outside involvement, and the household structure appeared stable from the exterior. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives began examining Mason's account, comparing his statements with physical evidence and recorded timelines. Several inconsistencies emerged, including discrepancies about the direction of gunfire, the supposed escape vehicle, and his actions before contacting authorities. Ballistic analysis indicated the shots were fired from inside the residence using a family-owned handgun. Investigators also documented that no external footprints, tire tracks, or disturbed soil supported the intruder claim. Digital data, including timestamp communications and Mason's movements inside the home, further narrowed the window of opportunity, placing him in proximity to the victims at key points in the timeline. During subsequent questioning, inconsistencies intensified, prompting investigators to apply additional scrutiny to his narrative. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. The breakthrough occurred when detectives confronted Mason with the combined ballistic, digital, and physical evidence contradicting his version of events. Investigators reported that the juvenile eventually admitted responsibility during a recorded statement, acknowledging there had been no intruder and that he had staged the initial report. He was arrested and later charged with multiple counts of capital murder. Prosecutors filed motions to try him as an adult based on the severity of the offenses and the number of victims involved. Detention records detailed Mason's behavior following the arrest, including attempts to alter his earlier explanations. His legal status shifted as hearings progressed, solidifying the decision to proceed under adult criminal statutes. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, confession details, and analyses of the weapon used in the homicides. Defense counsel focused on the defendant's age and developmental factors, raising questions about juvenile culpability in cases involving severe charges. The jury found Mason guilty of capital murder on multiple counts. Because he was a juvenile at the time of the offense, sentencing options were limited. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Subsequent appellate challenges argued issues surrounding interrogation methods and juvenile sentencing standards, but appellate courts upheld the conviction and the penalty. Public discussion continued regarding motive, with analysts citing household tensions, while others argued the case lacked a definitive psychological explanation. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 2. On February 18, 1988, 4 members of the Brahm family were discovered. Deceased inside their Rochester, Minnesota home. The only son unaccounted for was 16-year-old David Brahm, whose absence immediately drew the attention of investigators. According to early accounts at his school, peers had circulated rumors that David had spoken about harming his family the night before, pushing detectives to examine his whereabouts more closely. While the scene provided few external clues, the missing son and surrounding conversations quickly narrowed the field of focus toward him. The case began when school officials reported that David had unexpectedly failed to attend classes, prompting welfare concerns that led authorities to conduct a check at the Brahm residence. Police entered the home and found the parents and two siblings deceased, each showing signs of extensive blunt force trauma consistent with an axe attack. No forced entry was observed anywhere in the house, and nothing suggested a break-in or outside intrusion. Investigators documented undisturbed doors, intact windows, and no exterior footprints that would indicate an unknown offender. The interior layout and lack of disturbance reinforced the conclusion that the attacker was someone inside the home. With no evidence pointing outward, and the lone missing family member unaccounted for, the scene raised more questions than answers. The victims were Bernard and Paulette Brahm and two of their younger children, forming a family that, from the outside, appeared stable and private. Background interviews with relatives and acquaintances revealed recent tensions between David and his father, including reported disagreements over rules, discipline, and school behavior. Those who knew the family noted that arguments had escalated in the weeks leading up to the murders, creating a volatile dynamic beneath an otherwise ordinary household surface. David had struggled socially and academically, and several accounts described rising frustration that had not been addressed through formal intervention. As investigators pieced together the family's history, tensions within the home became a central area of inquiry. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives conducted a full search of the residence and recovered a blood-stained axe believed to be the murder weapon, located in an area consistent with internal access rather than forced entry. Investigators began interviewing classmates, who reported that David had made troubling statements about hurting his family shortly before the murders. These witness accounts aligned with the scene's physical evidence, strengthening the theory that the assailant was a family member. Forensic examinations confirmed that the wounds were consistent with the recovered weapon, further reinforcing the investigative direction. As authorities traced David's movements after he left home, additional statements surfaced from peers who claimed he had described the killings directly. Then, testimony from key witnesses revealed what had really happened. The breakthrough occurred when police located David after tracking peer disclosures and situational leads indicating he had spent time with friends following the murders. He was taken into custody, and during early stages of legal processing, the defense raised an insanity argument, asserting significant psychological instability at the time of the offense. Prosecutors countered with physical evidence, witness statements, and behavioral patterns documented before and after the killings. Evaluations were conducted, but examiners ultimately determined he was capable of understanding his actions. The insanity defense was rejected, and David was formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. When confronted with the collective evidence, the case moved rapidly into the trial phase. Court proceedings resulted in convictions on 4 counts of first-degree murder, leading to the imposition of multiple life sentences under Minnesota law. For years, Brahm remained incarcerated with parole eligibility projected decades into the future. Later legislative changes in Minnesota restructured juvenile sentencing for offenders convicted of severe crimes, enabling limited forms of structured work-release placements for long-term inmates. These policy adjustments allowed David to transition into a supervised halfway house program under strict monitoring. Public response to his change in custody status remained divided, with ongoing debates about the balance between rehabilitation and accountability. To this day, the case remains a reference point in discussions of juvenile offenders convicted of extreme violence. Case 3. On May 21, 1998, police discovered that William and Faith Kinkle had been shot inside their Springfield, Oregon home. The following morning, a shooting erupted at Thurston High School, where 2 students were killed and many others wounded. The suspect was apprehended alive after being tackled by classmates. When authorities connected Th.E. incidents, The timeline showed that the school attack occurred less than a day after the killings at the family residence. Investigators immediately began piecing together the link between the two scenes and the suspect's movements. The case began the previous day, on May 20, when Kip Kinkle was detained at school for bringing a stolen handgun onto campus. He was suspended and sent home pending disciplinary action. Later that evening, his parents were shot inside their home. Their bodies were discovered only after the school shooting the next morning, when officers checked the residence as part of the unfolding investigation. The timeline suggested the homicides occurred shortly after Kip returned home from school authorities' custody. The absence of forced entry, combined with the earlier firearm incident, formed the initial framework for investigators assessing the events. As details emerged, the sequence made it clear that both incidents were connected. The victims were Kinkle's parents, who for years had attempted to manage their son's escalating behavioral and psychiatric issues. They sought professional evaluations, followed treatment plans, and monitored medications intended to stabilize symptoms related to paranoia and intrusive thoughts. School counselors and specialists had provided input, documenting the family's efforts to address emerging risks. Despite interventions, Kip's fascination with firearms, explosives, and violent ideation intensified over time. His parents maintained structured rules around weapons and discipline, trying to limit access while supporting treatment. Their ongoing attempts to manage his condition reflected broader concerns within the household. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives recovered multiple weapons used in both the homicides and the school shooting, including rifles, pistols, knives, and ammunition. A search of the Kinkle home uncovered journals, writings, and digital materials indicating sustained preoccupation with violence, self-harm, and mass casualty fantasies. Entries referenced perceived threats, delusional beliefs, and detailed plans that pointed toward premeditation rather than spontaneous action. Investigators also located evidence of homemade explosive devices and components consistent with bomb making. These materials aligned with concerns previously noted by school staff and mental health professionals. Forensic analysis connected the recovered firearms to rounds used in the attacks. Then, journal entries revealed what had really happened. Kinkle was apprehended at the high school after students overpowered him during the shooting and held him until police arrived. Once in custody, he was transported to a secure facility and evaluated. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Early in the proceedings, Kinkle entered guilty pleas, avoiding a protracted trial on factual disputes. The legal focus shifted to sentencing, where mental health considerations were presented alongside the severity of the offenses. Expert evaluations documented serious psychiatric conditions, but these findings did not alter the statutory requirements tied to the crimes. When confronted with the evidence in court, the case moved directly into sentencing. He received a sentence totaling 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole, structured through consecutive terms mandated under Oregon's Measure 11 sentencing laws. Defense appeals argued that the punishment for a juvenile offender violated evolving standards for sentencing minors, particularly given documented psychiatric impairments. Appellate courts rejected these challenges, upholding both the conviction and the sentence across multiple rulings. Kinkle remains incarcerated under current Oregon law, with no parole mechanism available. Legal filings seeking resentencing continue periodically, but have not altered his status. To this day, the case remains central in discussions surrounding juvenile offenders convicted of extreme violence. Case 4. On January 25, 2019, deputies conducting a welfare check at the Amato family home in Chuluota, Florida, discovered 3 deceased individuals inside the residence. The surviving son, 29-year-old Grant Amato, was later located at a hotel several miles away. Initial observations inside the house suggested elements of staging, including the positioning of a firearm near one of the victims. According to investigators, the first signs of concern emerged when inconsistencies appeared between the scene layout and the narrative offered by the surviving family member. Within days, attention shifted toward Grant as evidence developed. The case began when relatives were unable to contact the family and requested authorities perform a welfare visit. Inside the residence, deputies found the bodies of Chad, Margaret, and their older son, Cody Amato. All three had been shot, with the weapon placed near Cody's body in a manner consistent with a staged murder-suicide. The crime scene indicated the homicides occurred on the night of January 24. No signs of forced entry were documented, and the interior conditions suggested the victims had been attacked at close range. Forensic patterns contradicted the initial appearance of a self-inflicted gunshot. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, digital and physical discrepancies accumulated. But the staged elements inside the home did not match the initial implication. The victims were Grant's parents and his brother, all of whom had supported him financially during ongoing issues related to unemployment and debt. Relatives later reported that the family had attempted multiple interventions after discovering Grant had spent large sums of money on an online webcam model. Financial records showed continuous transfers and escalating theft from family accounts. The parents had recently imposed limits on funding and required Grant to seek treatment for compulsive online spending. Cody, who had also contributed financially, experienced significant loss due to Grant's siphoning of funds. These issues produced friction within the household, building tension over financial strain and broken trust. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby locations, revealing Grant's movements before and after the time of death. Banking logs documented extensive transactions associated with the defendant's online activity, confirming motive and financial conflict. Forensic ballistics identified the firearm as one belonging to a family member, not consistent with an external assailant. Digital forensics uncovered attempts to manipulate devices and accounts following the victims' deaths, including online logins using a deceased parent's fingerprint. Additional analysis exposed inconsistencies in Grant's explanations regarding arrival times, phone activity, and the placement of the gun near Cody's body. Then, the combined digital and forensic evidence revealed what had really happened. Grant was located at a hotel and detained for questioning, as inconsistencies continued to accumulate. Investigators confronted him with contradictions between his statements and the physical and digital evidence recovered from the home. As the forensic analysis strengthened the connection between Grant and the homicides, authorities charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Court documents detailed financial motive, scene staging indicators, and post-offense behavior that aligned with deliberate concealment rather than self-defense or external threat. When confronted with the compiled evidence, prosecutors moved the case toward trial on all counts. During trial proceedings, the state pursued the death penalty based on multiple victims and premeditation. Jurors reviewed forensic documentation, surveillance reconstruction, and financial evidence outlining the defendant's thefts and escalating behavior. The defense presented mitigation arguments noting Grant's lack of prior criminal history, but did not dispute key forensic findings. The jury did not reach unanimous agreement on imposing death, which under Florida law required unanimity. As a result, the court sentenced Grant Amato to life without the possibility of parole. His conviction was later reviewed and affirmed on appeal. To this day, the case remains a reference point in discussions of digital-driven violence and family-related homicides. Case 5. On December 10, 2003, the Whitaker family returned to their Sugar Land, Texas home after having dinner to celebrate what they believed was their son Bart's upcoming college graduation. As they walked inside, shots were fired at close range. Kevin Whitaker and his mother, Patricia, were killed instantly, while the father, Kent, survived with severe injuries. Bart, who had remained briefly outside, claimed an intruder ambushed the family. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared when the scene showed signs of staging. Within days, attention shifted toward Bart. The case began the moment the family entered the residence. The shooting unfolded quickly, with the attacker striking from a position consistent with prior access to the home. Bart re-entered seconds later, presenting a gunshot wound to his arm that investigators later noted appeared superficial and consistent with staging. Kent Whitaker was transported to a hospital in critical condition. Inside the home, police observed no forced entry, undisturbed windows, and an alarm system that had not been breached. These details conflicted with the image of an unknown intruder lying in wait. As detectives examined shell casings and entry patterns, disparities between Bart's account and the physical evidence mounted. But the staged intrusion did not match the initial story. The victims were Patricia and Kevin Whitaker, a mother and son deeply involved in their church and community, and Kent Whitaker, a respected businessman. The family had gathered earlier that evening to celebrate Bart's alleged graduation, unaware he had dropped out semesters earlier. Bart had maintained an elaborate deception about his academic life, complete with fabricated documents and false milestones. Relatives later reported that the family had invested emotionally and financially in his education, unaware of the extent of his misrepresentations. The planned celebration amplified their sense of pride and trust. Investigators later established that Bart orchestrated the evening to create a predictable timeline. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. During the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence indicating the attack was not spontaneous. A duffel bag containing critical materials, firearms, clothing, and other items was recovered from a lake, linking the crime to accomplices Bart had recruited. Accomplice testimony revealed that Bart had planned the attack for months, previously attempting to enlist others before settling on the final group. Investigators documented communication trails, financial arrangements, and earlier failed attempts that established a clear pattern of planning. Forensic evidence linked the recovered weapon to the crime scene, and law enforcement determined that Bart had provided access codes and keys to facilitate the shooter's entry. Then, accomplice statements revealed what had really happened. The breakthrough came when the shooter, Chris Brashear, confessed to authorities, identifying Bart as the architect of the plan. Investigators also located the third participant, Stephen Champagne, whose statements corroborated the timeline. Bart had fled to Mexico after suspicion grew, prompting cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities. He was arrested, extradited, and charged with capital murder based on his role in orchestrating the killings. Prosecutors built their case around premeditation, motive, and Bart's central involvement in the planning. When confronted with accomplice confessions, forensic findings, and documented evidence, the legal framework moved swiftly toward trial. Bart Whitaker was convicted of capital murder, and the jury sentenced him to death, noting the deliberate planning and multiple victims. His accomplices received lesser sentences. Brashear received life imprisonment, and Champagne received 15 years. Years later, Bart's father, Kent, publicly opposed his execution, advocating for clemency despite being a victim himself. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles eventually recommended commuting the sentence, and in 2018, the governor replaced Bart's death sentence with life without parole. The decision generated significant public debate about forgiveness, proportional sentencing, and the role of surviving victims in capital cases. To this day, the case remains a point of ongoing discussion. Case 6. On April 18, 1991, an Italian couple was found murdered inside their home in Montecchia di Crosara, Veneto. Their son, 19-year-old Pietro Masso, appeared at the scene showing limited visible distress, drawing early attention from investigators. According to the initial assessment, the lack of forced entry and the controlled nature of the environment suggested an internal offender rather than an outside intruder. As authorities gathered statements and reviewed Pietro's behavior, inconsistencies emerged. Within days, suspicion shifted toward him as details surrounding motive and conduct became clearer. The case began the night before, when Antonio Masso and his wife, Maria Rosa, returned home from a church-related meeting. As they entered the darkened residence, they were attacked with blunt objects wielded by multiple individuals waiting inside. The assault was highly targeted, with no signs of struggle elsewhere in the home and no evidence of robbery or forced access. Investigators documented that the lighting had been manipulated, likely to disorient the victims upon entry. The attackers fled shortly afterward, while Pietro created an alibi by spending part of the night out with acquaintances. When he reported discovering their bodies, the timeline and staged emotional presentation did not align with the scene. But the details of the nighttime attack raised immediate questions. The victims were members of a middle-class household known for financial stability and strong community involvement. Their son, Pietro, had been expressing dissatisfaction with his lifestyle and sought rapid financial independence. Relatives later shared that Pietro displayed increasing interest in luxury items, nightlife, and social status, none of which aligned with his actual means. Investigators learned that he had grown frustrated with the pace of his personal financial progress and had spoken openly about wanting access to family resources sooner rather than later. Friends noted remarks suggesting entitlement to the family's assets. As authorities explored the family's dynamics, Pietro's financial focus became central. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. As detectives questioned Pietro's social circle, accomplices began cooperating with law enforcement. Their accounts revealed that the murders were not spontaneous, but the result of multiple earlier plots, including discussions of poisoning, staged burglaries, and planned explosions. These prior attempts had failed due to logistical issues or second thoughts among the group. Evidence showed that Pietro had assumed the leadership role, coordinating meetings, arranging tools, and assigning responsibilities for the final plan. Investigators also uncovered discarded materials and communications documenting planning sessions. The consistencies across accomplice statements aligned closely with the crime scene and timeline. Then, the coordinated testimonies revealed what had really happened. Police arrested Pietro after accomplice confessions directly implicated him as the planner and primary motivator behind the attack. Under questioning, participants described Pietro's central role in recruiting them with promises of financial gain after the inheritance transferred. Authorities formally charged him with double murder, supported by physical evidence and cooperative testimony. The other members of the group received separate charges proportional to their involvement. Pietro's conduct following the murders, including attempts to maintain a casual demeanor and inquiries about property matters, further reinforced prosecutorial arguments. When confronted with the accumulated statements and evidence, the case advanced rapidly toward trial. Pietro received a 30-year sentence, the maximum allowed under Italian law at the time for his age category. His accomplices received reduced terms based on roles and cooperation. While imprisoned, Pietro participated in rehabilitation programs and later became eligible for semi-liberty, allowing limited work release conditions during daytime hours. In 2013, after sentence reductions and good behavior credits, he was granted full release. The decision sparked national controversy, with public debate centered on sentencing limits, rehabilitation frameworks, and proportional punishment in cases involving parricide. Discussions continued as the case became emblematic of broader concerns about juvenile and young adult sentencing in serious violent crimes. Case 7. In September 2004, authorities responding to a welfare request entered a home near Maitland, Florida, and found two women deceased inside, Terry Brandt and her niece, Michelle Jones. A male relative, Terry's husband, Charlie Brandt, was also located in the residence, dead by suicide in the garage. According to investigators, the first signs of concern appeared when family members reported unanswered calls and unusual silence. Within hours of discovery, attention shifted toward Charlie as the only individual capable of committing the homicides before taking his own life. The case began when friends became alarmed after failing to reach Michelle Jones for several days. Deputies conducting the welfare check entered the residence and discovered Michelle and Terry with injuries consistent with sharp force trauma. Charlie was found hanged in a separate area of the home, and evidence indicated the sequence was a double homicide followed by suicide. The interior scene showed no signs of forced entry, robbery, or outside intrusion. The layout and controlled environment indicated the victims were attacked inside a familiar space. As investigators examined the remains and scene characteristics, the precision and severity of the injuries drew immediate attention. But the welfare entry revealed a homicide-suicide sequence with deeper implications. The victims were Charlie's wife, Terry, and her niece, Michelle, with whom they were staying temporarily during a hurricane evacuation. As authorities documented the scene, Charlie's background was re-examined, revealing a juvenile case from 1971 in which he fatally shot his pregnant mother and critically injured his father in Indiana at age 13. He had been committed to a psychiatric facility, but was released after approximately 1 year, with limited supervision thereafter. For decades, he lived without known violent incidents, maintaining employment and relationships without raising suspicion. The connection between the 1971 case and the 2004 homicides emerged only after his death, reshaping perceptions of his past. It would take only days for their quiet lives to unravel. Investigators began analyzing the home and Charlie's possessions, uncovering anatomical drawings, medical references, and digital searches focused on autopsies and dissection. These materials indicated long-term preoccupation with anatomical study beyond casual interest. Detectives also reviewed unsolved homicides in Florida, identifying similarities between Michelle's injuries and those in a 1989 case involving Sherry Per. Isho, whose death had remained unresolved. Forensic comparisons and behavioral pattern assessments linked wound characteristics and offender knowledge to Charlie. These parallels prompted a broader review of cold cases in surrounding counties. Then, the reconstructed pattern revealed what had really happened. Although Charlie was deceased, investigators proceeded with post-mortem analysis of his possible involvement in additional crimes. The most significant breakthrough occurred when authorities formally connected him to the 1989 Perisho homicide, citing matching injury patterns and geographic proximity to his residence at the time. With no living offender to charge, the cold case was administratively closed, naming Charlie as the responsible party. Law enforcement publicly stated that he may have committed additional homicides based on similarities in victim injuries and his access to isolated areas, though no further cases were definitively proven. When confronted with the cumulative evidence, agencies classified the pattern as consistent with serial offending. There was no trial due to Charlie's suicide, leaving many questions unresolved. Investigators maintained that his juvenile matricide, combined with the 1989 and 2004 homicides, formed a probable serial pattern spanning decades. Public records reflect uncertainty regarding how many victims may have been involved, as evidence gaps and the absence of direct forensic links limited definitive conclusions. Analysts continue to reference the case in discussions of undetected long-term offenders and the challenges of identifying violent histories when juvenile records are sealed or minimized. Although no formal conviction followed, the investigative findings established a pattern that remains significant in criminal case studies. Case 8. On August 20, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were found shot to death in the den of their Beverly Hills home. Their adult sons, Lyle and Eric, reported discovering the bodies after returning to the residence. According to early assessments, the brutality of the attack and the couple's financial status led investigators to consider the possibility of a professional hit. The brothers displayed emotional reactions, but provided limited detail about events prior to the shooting. As inconsistencies later emerged, attention gradually shifted toward them. The case began with a 911 call placed by the brothers reporting that their parents had been killed. Responding officers entered the home theater and found the victims with multiple shotgun wounds. The scene exhibited elements resembling an organized assault, including close-range firing and lack of robbery indicators. Initial theories suggested a retaliatory killing tied to business disputes involving Jose's entertainment and corporate ventures. Detectives documented the house as intact with no forced entry, and the presence of high-value items left untouched supported the idea of targeted intent. As timelines were reconstructed, however, discrepancies surfaced between the brothers' accounts and the scene dynamics. But the early assumption of a professional hit began to weaken as more details arose. The victims were Jose Menendez, a successful entertainment executive, and his wife Kitty, a former schoolteacher and actress. The family lived in a high-profile neighborhood and maintained an affluent lifestyle. Lyle and Eric, both in their late teens and early 20s, were enrolled in college but were also documented engaging in substantial discretionary spending. Their activities included expensive cars, luxury clothing, dining, and travel, with accounts indicating rapid expenditures following the deaths. Friends and associates noted ongoing family tensions involving expectations, performance pressure, and household dynamics. Investigators later evaluated these factors to contextualize broader motives. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. As the investigation progressed, authorities uncovered financial records showing the brothers significant post-homicide spending, including luxury purchases within weeks of the killings. Gun purchase documents linked Lyle to shotguns consistent with those used in the attack. The case advanced dramatically when taped therapy sessions with Eric's psychologist surfaced, containing disclosures about involvement in the homicides. Although legal battles surrounded admissibility, portions of the conversations became central to the investigation. Detectives also assembled timelines showing planning behaviors and the elimination of forced entry scenarios. Then, combined financial and testimonial evidence revealed what had really happened. Prosecutors convened a grand jury and secured indictments against both brothers, alleging coordinated planning and joint participation in the homicides. Lyle was arrested first, followed by Eric after returning from overseas. The trial featured joint proceedings, with the prosecution arguing shared motive and mutual action, while the defense presented claims involving long-term family dysfunction and abuse. The court evaluated ballistic evidence, financial activity, and the brothers' post-offense conduct. When confronted with the comprehensive evidence, the proceedings moved toward sequential jury deliberations. Both brothers were ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy charges. The sentencing court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing premeditation and financial motive. Numerous appeals followed, including challenges based on procedural issues, jury instructions, and the admissibility of therapeutic recordings. None resulted in overturning the convictions. Periodic public debate continues regarding the balance between the prosecution's financial motive theory and the defense's allegations of abuse within the household. To this day, the Menendez case remains one of the most widely discussed familial homicide prosecutions in the United States. Case 9. On July 15, 2001, 3 members of the Gonzalez family were found deceased inside their North Ryde home in Sydney. The surviving son, 20-year-old Seth Gonzalez, told police that he believed an unknown intruder had entered the residence and attacked his parents and sister. According to first responders, the lack of forced entry and the controlled condition of the interior raised early concerns about the plausibility of that account. As inconsistencies surfaced in Seth's statements, investigators focused increasingly on his role in the sequence of events. The case began when neighbors reported unusual quiet and observed the family car unmoved for a prolonged period. Police entering the home found the victims with multiple stab wounds and noted graffiti on the walls referencing racial motives. The placement of the messages and the manner of the attack suggested an intentional attempt to deflect suspicion toward an external hate-driven offender. No property was missing, and the house showed no signs of a struggle beyond the homicide area. The scene suggested staged indicators designed to imply an outsider's involvement. As investigators compared the physical evidence with the intruder claim, inconsistencies rapidly accumulated. But the staged graffiti would ultimately undermine the initial narrative. The victims were Seth's parents, Teddy and Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and his younger sister, Claudine, members of a migrant family known for academic diligence and strong community participation. The parents maintained high expectations for Seth's educational performance, providing structured support for university pursuits. Investigators learned that Seth had recently faced academic setbacks, including falsified grades and suspension notices concealed from his parents. Financial concerns involving future inheritance and projected career outcomes were examined as part of the broader context. Relatives and acquaintances reported rising tension within the household as Seth attempted to maintain the appearance of academic success. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. As detectives analyzed the evidence, numerous contradictions surfaced. Purchase records linked Seth to clothing, gloves, and items matching materials used during the offense. DNA traces found on clothing discarded in a public bin aligned with the family environment, undermining the intruder hypothesis. Surveillance footage and time-stamped receipts created discrepancies around Seth's stated movements, placing him at locations inconsistent with his alibi. Investigators also noted that items allegedly stolen by the supposed intruder were later found in Seth's possession. Collectively, the physical, digital, and forensic records revealed a timeline incompatible with his claims. Then, the cumulative evidence revealed what had really happened. Police arrested Seth after compiling the inconsistencies surrounding his narrative, supported by forensic and digital records. Prosecutors argued that the primary motive involved financial gain tied to significant inheritance, along with reputational concerns related to academic deception. Evidence presented at preliminary hearings included purchase histories, DNA testing, and behavioral analysis. Seth denied involvement, but inconsistencies in his statements and actions following the homicides weakened the defense. The prosecution emphasized deliberate staging, intent to mislead investigators, and steps taken to conceal academic failures. When confronted with the collective evidence, charges moved forward to trial. Seth was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The sentencing judge cited the severity of the crimes, the calculated staging, and the motive structure as justification for the penalty. Subsequent policy action by the New South Wales government removed any future parole eligibility, effectively ensuring permanent incarceration. Multiple appeals challenging CTS of forensic evidence and procedural decisions failed to overturn the conviction. The case remains a significant reference in discussions involving staged homicide scenes, inheritance motives, and academically driven familial conflict within immigrant households. Case 10. On November 15, 2004, police responding to a welfare request found Peter Porco deceased and his wife, Joan, critically injured inside their Delmer, New York residence. Early scene assessments showed severe blunt force trauma consistent with an axe attack. Surveillance footage and travel logs later placed their adult son, Christopher Porco, on a timeline linking him to the home during the critical overnight hours. According to investigators, the first signs of concern appeared when inconsistencies arose between Christopher's statements and documented movements. The case began when Peter Porco failed to appear at a courthouse where he worked, prompting colleagues to request a welfare check. Deputies arrived at the family home and discovered Peter in the entry area with fatal injuries, and Joan alive but gravely wounded in the bedroom. The suspected weapon, an axe, was recovered inside the residence, showing no signs of forced entry or struggle indicative of an outsider's break-in. The house appeared orderly, with no theft indicators, and the specific nature of the attack suggested familiarity with the victim's routines. As detectives reconstructed the overnight timeline, the controlled environment contradicted any intrusion scenario, but the welfare-triggered entry revealed deeper inconsistencies. The victims were long-standing community members known for their stable household and support for their adult sons. Investigators learned that Christopher had been receiving significant financial assistance from his parents, including payments for tuition, housing, and vehicle obligations. Records showed that he had engaged in forgery of his father's signature to secure loans and had continued deceptive practices involving university management and financial institutions. Behavioral issues, including misrepresentation of academic status and attempts to conceal debts, created mounting tension. These dynamics redirected investigative attention toward financial strain and interpersonal conflict. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives examined Christopher's movements through vehicle tracking, toll booth records, and surveillance footage captured along the interstate. These records indicated travel during the exact window in which the attack occurred. Investigators also reviewed financial data showing recent attempts to address escalating debts and forged documents involving his father's identity. Although no direct DNA or fingerprints placed him inside the home at the time of the attack, the circumstantial evidence aligned into a coherent timeline. Forensic analysis confirmed the weapon's placement and trajectory patterns consistent with an internal offender. Then, the compiled travel and financial records revealed what had really happened. Christopher was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for his father's death and attempted murder for the attack on his mother. Prosecutors argued that the motive stemmed from financial pressure, deception exposure, and escalating conflict with his parents. Bail was denied due to the severity of the allegations and the strength of the circumstantial framework. Defense counsel challenged the reliability of the circumstantial evidence, emphasizing the absence of direct forensic links. Nevertheless, the prosecution's timeline reconstruction, digital travel mapping, and financial documentation formed the core of the case. When confronted with the unified circumstantial structure, proceedings advanced to full trial. A jury convicted Christopher on all charges, resulting in 2 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life. Appeals challenged aspects of witness testimony, circumstantial methodology, and judicial rulings, but appellate courts upheld the conviction. Subsequent CPL 440 motions raised procedural and evidentiary issues, extending post-conviction litigation. Public interpretation of the case remains divided, with some citing the strength of circumstantial evidence and others questioning the absence of direct forensic proof. To this day, the Porco case is a prominent example of a homicide prosecution built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence.